Thank you, Bill, for the opportunity. Yes, I'd just like to highlight an inaugural event last year. Hopefully it will become an annual event, the Rams Island Picnic. And I'll quote, as always when talking about Tone, it's best to quote directly from the man himself. So this was shortly after the commitment to the Republican ideal was taken to new heights on Cave Hill. What he said was, the most agreeable day we passed during our stay, one of the most agreeable of our lives, was on an excursion we made with the Sims, Nielsen and Russell to Rams Island, a beautiful and romantic spot in Loch Ness. Nothing can be imagined more delightful, and we agreed in whatever quarter we might find ourselves respectively to commemorate the anniversary of that day, the 11th of June. Another short sentence he said at a later stage, tell Mrs. Sims we talked 1,000 times of our excursion to Rams Island. I'm sure we here shall not be so happy until we shall go there again, if ever that happens.
Huzzah!
So, yes, it is 15 miles west of here. It is close, but it is remote. It is the repository of over 1,000 years of our history.
Let's do it. We should go then. June 11th. Mark your calendar.
It will be promoted through the wonderful organisation, Reclaim the Enlightenment. So you'd all be welcome. Numbers will be limited, but watch this space.
Thank you, sir.
And there's little flyers downstairs as a reminder on that. And also, if you could take a flyer for Douglas Week 2024, another great Liberal initiative, and also anti-slavery Belfast. If you're interested in that, you can take a flyer for that.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, and thank you very much for this.
Thanks for coming.
Wonderful.
Okay, now we're ready to, and just as an aside, that is a huzzah. Everybody should go. Tone loved Belfast. He absolutely loved it here. And when he came here, you cannot help but to feel the amount of love that he felt for this place. And it was part of our intention to start the commemoration because of the love that he had for Belfast. So I hope that it's coming through because we certainly have been welcomed by the Belfast family. I really, really appreciate it. Thank you very much. Moving on now to our second panel in the afternoon. Chairing the second panel, she barely needs an introduction. Marianne Elliott, legend, the writer of the definitive story of Wolfe Tone, the 1989 volume Wolfe Tone, Prophet of Irish Independence. And if we don't get a chance, Marianne, my cousin Wolf has a copy he brought with him.
I've already done it.
Oh, okay, good, very well. Okay, just so we make that connection. I won't go over a lot about Marianne, except academically in 91 to 93, when she became the Andrew Geddes John Ratkin Professor of Modern History at the University of Liverpool. She was that until her retirement from her post, also director of the Institute of Irish Studies at the university. In addition to her academic career, Ms. Elliott has played an important part in the promotion of peace efforts in Northern Ireland, notably serving on the OPSHA committee in 93 and co-writing its report, A Citizen's Inquiry. And with no further ado, Marianne Elliott.
Well, thanks, Bill, and your family for making us all so welcome. I've just come to the Belfast side of it, not because I don't want to go back to Dublin and see old friends, just because I'm horribly busy at the moment. And I was actually in Belfast just over 2 weeks ago. I felt as if I should have just stayed in the airport and come back again. But it's lovely to see very old friends. I feel a bit of an imposter here today because, yes, I wrote an awful lot about the United Irishmen and particularly about Tone. And I was terribly privileged when I was writing my biography of Wolfe Tone that I was befriended by his direct descendants and had access to not only their oral history, but all their papers, including the papers of Matilda Tone that had never been used before. And his great-great-granddaughter, Kay Dickinson, became my closest friend. And I thought Tone would have been very proud of her, because when I went to present her with the copy of the Tone book, she rushed straight out to the kitchen, came back with a bottle of champagne that she insisted about an opening. She was quite an elderly woman by this stage. And I said, but there's only two of us. She said, so what, Tone, what are we proud of us? And she was polished up. She was just a great partier. And amongst those papers that she had, as I was working in them, I found a whole drawer full of accounts and pictures of her as a flapper in the 1920s. It was just amazing, you know, she was just an amazing woman. So it's lovely to see old friends again. I do feel a little bit of an imposter because it's a long time since I worked on this. People don't seem to know that I'm on my second book about 1950s Belfast, because it's still about Wolfe Tone. This is the third occasion, fourth occasion I've been invited to this year, both in England and over in Ireland, that I've been asked to talk about Wolfe Tone. So essentially, somebody that I kind of more or less lived with, you know, in my imagination and in the homes of his direct descendants, you know, has never gone away. And he's just such an amazing person that I'm actually quite glad of it, you know, that I've never really lost touch with him. So thanks again for this. Well, today, in terms of timing, we're running a little bit late. Do people have 20 minutes each and then a little bit of
That's how I was planning.
So that'll be great. Well, we're in for a treat. We've got three wonderful scholars here. Claire has done a me in reverse, because she started off working on religion and identity in Northern Ireland in her first book, a very, very fine book. And then we were crossing over because I was working at the same thing. And now you've kind of come back to this. And I'm kind of a bit jealous. I'm kind of missing it, you know. Maybe I'll do some more for it. And she started off as a sociologist at Queen's University, but she's been very heavily involved in the Reclaim the Enlightenment movement that is making such a difference to Belfast. And you can see it physically. You can see it, you know, in the... Although I must admit, you know, Henry's Tavern, and the funny thing that, what was it? It was in very bad taste, and I thought, oh God, yes. So there are good things in the kind, but you know what I'm talking about, you know, over near, yeah. But she's also just published a really wonderfully readable book called The Ghost Limb, Alternative Protestants in the Spirit of 98. In which it's partly a memoir in which she, coming from Presbyterian background, is reclaiming through a bit of history, a lot of oral history with other people, what the United Irishman meant to them. And I can thoroughly recommend it to you. I think I'll introduce them all separately because it wouldn't be fair.
That would be great.
Okay?
Thank you.
So.
Good evening, Harja. It's lovely to be here. Thank you so much for the generous invitation to talk today about the thriving scene of United Irish history in present-day Belfast and beyond. Thank you, Marianne, for the lovely introduction. This paper is more of a dispatch from the front line of community history, so I am definitely not an historian. I defer to all of you on that. But not only that, I suppose it's a thank you to the work that you've all done, and also to the families, to say, well, to show the ripples of your work and your descendants in the city today, because it's quite extraordinary. As Marianne mentioned, when I was in academia, I was a political sociologist. So a good way to think of me and the words I'm bringing you today is to think of me as an undercover sociologist. A delighted imposter, a participant and an observer. So I'll just be speaking from my own subjective experiences today, share some thoughts, and there are plenty of people here who will heckle me and keep me right, so get stuck in. if I make any mistakes. So as many of you know, there seems to be a big revival of 1798 histories in current day Belfast, in the north and in the south as well. Just to give you a flavour, it wouldn't be possible to talk about everything, but there's a 1798 walking tour run by Sean Pier and Colin Dorr. Stephen McCracken, who you heard from this morning, he does tours constantly in Antrim. I think you've had to put on about 50 in Lisburn because you keep selling out. There was a reenactment during the summer of the Battle of Antrim. Clifton House speaks for itself. The Marianne McCracken walking tour. Mark mentioned the anti-slavery walking tour. So it's interesting, like a lot of this action is taking place on the streets. And it's spilling out into the streets, as Marianne alluded to, in an interesting way. There are street art and pieces and heritage panels in Belfast entries and alleyways. I'll talk about that more in a minute. There's Henry Joy's bar. This is the statue you're talking about, the jailhouse bar, and they're kind of cocktail bars of the new school. You know, you can do whiskey tasting and you can do big sports screens. And there's a fiberglass statue of Henry Joy outside, which maybe wouldn't be the best likeness. But what I think is going on here is it's kind of a DIY heritage making, you know, in a city centre which has tried so hard to be so neutral and kind of scrub away any divisive histories. People are taking matters into their own hands. Although this is changing a bit at the official level. Some of you will have seen plans for the statue of Marianne McCracken for the grounds of Belfast City Hall. It's gorgeous, it's bronze, it's huge. There's already a bust in the City Hall, a small one on Clifton Street. There's a great new statue of a head school teacher, United Irishman, Tom Dunn, unveiled just a few months ago in Rostrevor. So it seems that something is happening. Reclaim the Enlightenment, the organisation that I'm involved in, we celebrate Bastille Day every July. And what we're trying to do on that day is make links between Belfast past and Belfast present. This year, John Gray gave a barnstorming speech where he explored the idea of civic republicanism and the case against the monarchy, which is interesting in the light of Olson's talk earlier. We're usually involved in Black History Month and the Expo, again making connections with modern migrant communities and people of colour in our city, drawing a line between the past and right now. We do Burns Night, the Heart Festival, reaching out like Ulster to the Ulster Scots and the Irish connection. We have a campaign, the Day of the Assembly Rooms, which was where the Heart Festival was. And we see that not just as an historic site and a heritage site, but we're also making a protest against a city of glass offices owned by vulture funds while the people of the city sit outside with no homes to go to. I was going to shout out for Mark's Rams Island trip because I said I would. So Mark, you were in there. I was going to say, it's in Lough Neagh.
Yeah, it'll be.
Lough Neagh is dying. So the tour, it'll be lovely. You won't get poisoned like you should. But it's just another really interesting connection between the present, past, and future. Sorry for everything I've missed. There's loads of people in this room doing loads more, but it would just be a list of a talk. So I'll get on now to what it means. But you can see that everything that we're doing, we're calling it history and it is heritage, but it is a sincere kind of effort to engage with what's happening in the here and now. The upstart in United Irish history, I think, is interesting at the minute because it's not monocultural. Some of the tours are run by Irish Republicans, members of Sinn Féin. Sinn Féin have just set up a William Orr coming in Antrim. Michael Long from the Alliance Party was the guy who proposed the statue of Marianne. And many of those currently engaged in commemoration and exploration are from Protestant backgrounds, like myself. Now, there's absolutely been a tendency amongst Protestants to keep the head down about 1798. The fear of speaking is really real historically and in the present. And Guy Biner has mapped this remembrance exquisitely. But I do wonder if this silence is beginning to lift a little, because most of the time when we're doing these 1798 events or the 1790s events, in the city, we're doing them together. Catholic, Protestant, dissenter, other heathen migrant, the list expands. The Tone would have liked that. And of course, when we attend and organise events like that in a place like Northern Ireland, a lot of us are doing deeper work. It's not just a wee day out. And often I think you find that people are seeking these events out deliberately as a way of reaching beyond the confines of tribe. I live in Newton Orange, which is really kind of unionist, loyalist town. And recently, John Gray had the brilliant idea of hiring the Newton Orange Town Hall to do a play that he had written about the Reverend Porter. And we did it on the big portrait of Lord Castlereagh. And I never forget, it was the start of July, sandwiched in between like the anti-protocol rallies and the 12th of July parades. And he put an ad in the local paper, or Stephen did, and I was worried that nobody would come, that there would be protests outside. But on the night, it was mad. We had Irish Republicans, we had local Orange men in the room, and everyone in between. At the start of the night, we were taking seats away, because nobody's coming to this. And by the end, we were like frantically trying to scramble seats from the whole of the town hall. A lovely Orange man came up to me afterwards. He says, I might join your historical society, you know, fight you from the inside. And I just love that. That's what it's all about. You know, nearly every 1798 event I've been to has been like this, such mixed company, quite raw and open conversation afterwards. And I really never cease to be amazed about the ability of this history to bring people together. But of course, all is not new and great and shiny and resolved in the north. Far from it. There are tensions and challenges as we try to find ways to explore and remember these histories together. The age-old discord about how different traditions remember 1798 continues to be a factor. It's a really robust and feisty space. One example, I wrote this book, The Ghostland, the new book, Alternative Protestants, in 1798. One thing I would say in terms of fearing to speak and that tendency to keep the head down, this book gives 20 stories of friends and people that I knew in the city. I offered everybody anonymity. Nobody took it. Everybody was bursting to say their piece. We took some care, but I think that is really significant and a change, you know, where a lot of books about the radical prods, the dissenting prods, there would have been a lot of hiding and anonymity in the past. The book's afterlife has been quite incredible. The last event this guy came to was the Sinn Féin Ardèche last weekend, where I was able to address a conference about kind of the spirit of 1798 and what's going on with alternative Protestants today. The event before that was a podcast with some loyalist friends. And sometimes I think, what am I doing? How can I keep myself safe doing this? How can I hold all of these conversations from Republicans through the loyalists in the same space? Because for me, that's what the work is about. And the values are there. It's not actually difficult to pick out the values like democracy and active citizenship and egalitarianism, where everybody's kind of rowing in behind them. There's a little bit of work in terms of finding a language that can land well on different people's ears. You do find yourself kind of code switching a little bit between audiences while speaking about ostensibly the same ideas. And there's obviously a job of work building trust so that those conversations can flourish. So I'm going to take you back just quickly to the Belfast entries. I'm going to read a wee bit, if that's okay, from a chapter in the book. So I'm with Gemma Reid, my childhood friend, and we're in the Belfast entries and alleys, just down the way there. And Gemma was part of a creative team that did a street art project focusing on the entries. And it came out of a Belfast City Council scheme to reanimate what had kind of become quite a forlorn and neglected part of the city. It's also the most exciting part of the city, right? Because it's the heart of radical Belfast in the 1790s. So the street artists were kind of given the history of the area and they were allowed to interpret the brief their own way. So this was my mate Gemma speaking. One artist focused on the life that used to be in the entries. The entries were once really busy places, humming with activity. There used to be little shop fronts all along here. People would hang out small painted boards outside to show what trade they were. The artist wanted to go back to that, so she painted all these little signs. It's kind of honouring the trades that used to be in here. And she was really interested in United Irishmen as advocates for equality. So the signs are all hand painted, and she's put gold leaf on one letter on each one. And if you find them and you add them together, it spells out the word equality. Like you're never gonna get that unless you know about it, but it's magical. And the next words, this is in my voice. I send pictures to Sean Napier, one of the Republican tour guides, when I get home from a day with Gemma. Sean is confused by the images. He types back immediately, why is it all so subtle? This is my first sign that others might not read the street art in the same way that I did. A year after my day with Gemma, I'm at a meeting of the United Irish Historical Society in Henry Joy's pub. Column Door, again, one of the tour guides puts it this way. They used the word equality, but then they made the letters small, and then they hid it. This hits me like lightning. To have experienced inequality in the city, to finally feel that there was a chance to speak, and how to him, it just felt inadequate. I say to Colm and Sean that I think the codedness of the art is almost part of our DNA in this place. Its subtlety feels like a second skin to me. I spent much of my life working out how to be said, what it's safe to say and where, and I felt that the art tapped into something really authentic about our history, radical politics hidden down side alleys and in the cultural underground. Now reading that back, I realise that's maybe more of a dissenting Protestant relationship. Colm and Sean asked me to dream bigger. They say deeply ingrained codedness is something that should be challenged, not accepted, but we should strive to be as radical and confident as the United Irishmen themselves. I hear what they're saying, and it stays with me. This conversation, of course, is not about the artists, it's about the political context in which the art takes place. Would Belfast City Council have improved anything more overt? Is that the job of this project? How do you convey the imperial and conservative context of the entries, for example, the sugar trade, in artwork that is confident and celebratory? Is that ahistorical? The Belfast Entries project was about urban regeneration. The art in the entries can only carry so much of the load in addressing the omission of 1798 from the city's built heritage. And that's just a flavour of the kind of conversations that are going on in this kind of community history world of 1798. And it's notable to me that people from all backgrounds keep showing up to wreck our own heads. Do you know, it's a dialogue that's happening in real time. It's raw and it's live, and it could sometimes be quite difficult and awkward, but it is hugely enriching. And most importantly, I think as people negotiate, as we negotiate this historical moment with one another, we're forming meaningful friendships and relationships. So the last bit, perhaps the most interesting question of all, is why are people doing this? Why are so many people trying to build this shared historical space in 2003? I think it's really helpful to, well, obviously understand it in the context of rapid social, political and cultural change. Brexit has moved goalposts. The north of Ireland is in a state of flux that makes community relationships like really difficult and touchy on one hand, but really urgent and vital on the other. And the desire amongst ordinary people for peace, for mixing and melding on the ground, it's enormous. And it really, in my opinion, is not reflected by our political deadlock. And my hunch is that some people are exploring these histories more in the current moment to unearth these shared historical narratives, to find some connection with one another. Secondly, the absence of stormont, the political vacuum, I think has created a great sense of powerlessness. I've been working around with this like gentle title, The Ghost Limb, for a couple of years, which I was using to kind of describe a party cut off, the hiddenness, the Protestant Irishness, I can't speak its name. And then I come across Wolfe Tone saying, being ruled from London is like having an amputated right hand. So, like, none of this subtle ghostling stuff. What he's talking about is the powerlessness and lack of agency that Westminster government can sometimes bring. So a lot of us these days are looking for democracy. We're asking, do we have it? We're asking, do we have any agency over our own lives? And I seem to be having a lot of conversations at the moment with people about wanting to become active citizens rather than passive observers. And of course, all of this feeds into the constitutional debate, which is very live at the minute, and in which 1798 is deeply relevant. The United Irish men and women have loads to teach us about inclusive nation building, how blow-in dissenters from Scotland can be part of shaping a national story, that shared values rather than ethnicity could be the key to a shared future. Really important thing to think about as we think about new waves of migration to the island. I'm not sure that people are gravitating to 1798 today out of kind of the old school desire for separatism, pure and simple. But speaking for myself, I am drawn to the democratic possibilities of civic republicanism, but in a way that kind of reaches out to friends, neighbours, islands, rather than ourselves alone. But the point is, we don't actually need to agree with each other's political ideas to be in this space. Others will interpret what's happening in really different ways to me. No heckles yet, though. But we're enriched by these differences. And I think many of us are listening hard, and we're learning, and we are allowing kind of personal evolution. Stephen Baker, my trade unionist friend, who's in this book, emailed me after reading an early draft. And this is what he said. I've often felt that there is a post-1798 melancholia in the North, a sort of community of mournful heritage enthusiasts looking for what might have been. But that's changed now. This feels like a moment of opportunity. It's also the start of something, the excavation, the recovery, the digging, it's necessary work. But we can't hang around in graveyards forever paying our respects to ghosts of dead generations. When we've done our excavations, what do we begin to build? And that's what I think the current interest in 1798 is all about. Looking back, being present, imagining the future, creating new stories of what might be possible.
Thank you for that wonderfully hopeful and optimistic paper. When people of my generation were interested in the United Irishmen, although I was more or less brought up in it by my actor father, who used to play in Tommy Conduff's nationalist plays. But I remember my old friend Tom Bartlett had a big role in the 1790s, 18th century choice for A-levels. You played quite a role in that, didn't you? And when you give talks way back then in the bicentenary of the French Revolution, you'd have huge audiences of school kids that you knew from their uniforms. Unfortunately, I come from Belfast, and it's kind of one of the sectarian identifiers. Oh yeah, you know where they come from. I don't think that's happening anymore. I may be wrong, but I don't think that wonderful option for A-level is available anymore. And I hope that I don't know. You definitely did teach it, but is it available?
It is available, but there are fewer schools doing it, and I think most schools do the modern Irish option, which in my view is a lot more binary and less idiosyncratic than the 18th century. And as students leave school and become teachers, they're teaching they're teaching what they were taught, in a sense, and the topics. And sadly, the 18th century is not as popular an option.
But I hope the excitement of your group and Belfast will actually revive some of this. Takes time, but certainly at the time it was very important for all of us of Tom's and my generation, that enthusiasm that was around, and it's so fingers crossed. And yeah, I mean, I used to teach it at university, but I'm not even sure. I mean, my old institute doesn't even have a modern historian anymore. So it's pretty awful. So the wonderful library I built up on the 1790s in Liverpool University is probably lying there gathering dust. So on to Katrina. Katrina's been worked very hardly here. Sorry, I think you're next to the podium.
I'm happy to go next.
Would you like a rest?
No, I can do
it. Katrina has written a lot, including a couple of books on soldiering in Britain and Ireland in the 18th century, and particularly at the time of the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. She's got a new book in the go. She's already been introduced by you as teaching at York University. There, said it again. Sure. So at least you're teaching the 18th century, thankfully. Her new book is on women politics and the Irish public sphere in the age of revolution, which will be coming out next year. So as one of the few people keeping the star alive for the 1790s in the universities, you're very welcome. So
related, I do teach a special subject in Ireland in the age of revolution at York, so I am trying to keep the flame alive there. So generations now, largely English students who know very little about 1798, but are beguiled by it, as I think many of us here have been. So great. So I'm going to be talking about Matilda Tone as a Republican relic. And in the 1950s, Rosamond Jacob, who was a Quaker, a Republican, a feminist, but also the author of a well-received history of the United Irishmen, she began writing a historical biography of Wolfe Tone's wife, Matilda. And that was eventually published as a historical novel in 1957. So Jacob's efforts to reconstruct the life and worlds of Matilda Tone in history and then in fiction speak, on the one hand, to the status that Wolfe Tone's widow had achieved within Republican memory. By the 20th century, she would be tightly woven into the weft of Tone's romantic narrative. But we can also see in this project some of the challenges that were involved in writing a history of Matilda Tone. So Jacob was clearly motivated by her desire to search out political foremothers from the canon of Irish Republican history. But you can see from the changing titles of the project, so the biography starts out being called Matilda Tone, so she's being approached as a figure in her own right. The working title then for the historical novel was The Rebel Wife, so trying to restore some agency to Matilda Tone. But by the time the novel is published in 1957, it's The Rebel's Wife. So we see Matilda Tone being kind of subsumed into the identity of her husband. And we can see from the manuscript for Jacob's biography of Matilda Tone just what a difficult task she had set herself in writing a biography of someone for whom very few surviving letters or sources survive. Matilda Tone was by all accounts an intelligent and astute woman, and her surviving writings suggest that she was quite a skilled writer and a perceptive political commentator. But her archive is quite thin and fragmentary. So consequently, the first half of Jacob's biography was really focused just drew on Tone's memoirs and journals. So we really just see Matilda through Tone's eyes. despite Jacob's very valiant efforts to kind of stress Matilda's political independence. So you can see in this passage where Jacob is outlining Tone's non-sectarian vision of an Ireland where brotherhood comes before dogma, before speculating that, quote, in all this, Matilda probably agreed with him, not because my husband thinks, but because she thought herself. So she's kind of having to speculate here. She wants to imagine Matilda as somebody who had her own political opinions. Tone's admiration for his wife was a recurring theme in his journals, which are partly addressed to her and which repeatedly praised her unstinting support for his ambitions, her cheerfulness in adversity, and her courage. So Matilda Tone emerges from the historical record as an intriguing but still quite shadowy figure. There's no known surviving portrait of her. I'm just looking to Marianne to confirm that. So that's right.
There wasn't.
There was
one.
surviving.
All papers were in the basement of Hayes House, but in my memory, it wasn't. It was a miniature of Tone himself.
Yeah.
I think you're all right.
Okay, I have clearance on that. But in the rest of the paper, I'd just like to explore Matilda Tone's status as a Republican relic. So she was only 29 years old when Wolfe Tone died, and she would live for another 5 decades in exile in Paris and later the United States. And by Republican relic, I mean it in both the arcane sense, so a signifying widow, but also in its more familiar sense as this kind of venerated object associated with the deceased. And I just want to think about some of the ways Matilda navigated her status as mourner-in-chief for Wolfe Tone and the various scripts that were written for her in terms of how she should perform that role. So the name by which we know her, Matilda, was of course not the name with which she was christened. Born Martha Witherington to a reasonably prosperous Dublin merchant, she was only 15 when she first met Tone through her brother, who was a fellow student at Trinity College Dublin, and only 17 when she married him. And it was Tone who bestowed upon her the name Matilda in reference to the character of Matilda, Lady Randolph, in John Hume's hugely popular 1756 Scottish tragedy, Douglas. And this is a role associated in particular with probably the most celebrated actress of the 18th century, Sarah Siddons, and she would perform in that role in Belfast in 1807. But it was also a part associated with Tone's youthful infatuation with the married woman Elizabeth Martin, whom he had performed opposite in amateur theatricals in Galway while Tone was staying there in 1783 on her husband's estate. So we might just think it's a little bit insensitive of Tone now to rename his wife, in honour of this kind of youthful romance, but also in a way prefigured, the naming prefigured Matilda's later destiny. In Hume's play Matilda, remains steadfast to the memory of her first husband following his death in battle, providing a powerful portrait of uxorial fidelity in tragic circumstances. So we can see here the world of the theatre, which as Jim talked about this morning, Wolfe Tone was deeply immersed in, furnishing one script for Matilda's performance of her role as wife and then widow of Tone. And the classical Republican tradition, which we also heard a lot about this morning, and which was, of course, a significant influence on the United Irishmen, would also furnish an additional script for the performance of Matilda's roles as wife and widow. So as you've heard, it's looked to classical antiquity for inspiration, and a model of republican femininity that was particularly associated with the virtuous matrons of the Roman Republic, and figures such as Portia, wife of Brutus, who supported her husband's efforts to save the Roman Republic from Julius Caesar's tyranny. And you can see here an early 19th century neoclassical painting showing Marcia saying farewell to Brutus, and this kind of tearless farewell. It's the final time she will see Brutus as he goes into exile after the assassination of Caesar. And this is a kind of austere but culturally significant model for the political partnership between husband and wife, according to which women were best able to serve the cause of the Republic by ruthlessly suppressing their personal feelings and interests and willingly sacrificing their husbands and sons to the cause of the Republic. And it's possible to trace Matilda's fulfillment of this Republican ideal in her apparent willingness to allow Tone to pursue his revolutionary ambitions, despite the great cost to her and her family. So she would follow him into exile in the United States in 1795. And in the ultimate act of Republican sacrifice, would not reveal to Tone that she was pregnant when he left once again to go to Paris to negotiate the French alliance, out of fear that she might undermine his resolve to do so. And in 1797, Matilda would cross the Atlantic once again to join Tone in Paris. And it was in Paris in November 1798 that she would hear the news of his death. And it's difficult really to overstate just how challenging the circumstances in which Matilda found herself after Tone's death must have been. She was grief-stricken, she had 3 young children, she was in what would turn out to be permanent exile from Ireland. And according to her son, William, she spoke very little French. But despite this, she would prove remarkably resourceful in ensuring that she and her family were provided for, arranging a personal interview with Lucien Bonaparte, so Napoleon's brother, in which she pressed her case for a more generous pension in recognition of Tone's services as a fallen French officer. And Bonaparte was so moved by her intervention that in a speech supporting additional provision for Matilda and her children, he not only paid tribute to Wolfe Tone as the illustrious martyr of liberty, but also invoked then the spirit of classical antiquity in paying tribute to Matilda's independent spirit and firmness. And he compared her to the women of ancient Sparta, who, when their countrymen returned from battle, would look to see if their sons, husbands or brothers were amongst the returning ranks. And if they didn't see them, they would exclaim with relief, they died for their country, they died for the Republic. So again, this is quite emotionally austere model of the Republican widow, one who would sacrifice her husband for the nation and then go on to dedicate her life to preserving his heroic memory and raising his children, her children in his image. And Matilda's performance of Republican widowhood was further encouraged by her continued contact with United Irish exiles in Paris and also in the United States. And they were able to openly commemorate Tone in a way that was much more difficult in Ireland. And we've already seen this medallion once today. And just to note that this is Bill, now in the possession of Bill Atkins. So I've had the honour to see it on Zoom. But this wonderful medallion, which was presented to Matilda Tone when she visited New York in 1807 by the Hibernian Provident Society of New York, and which is engraved to the worthy relict of the illustrious patriot general, Wolfe Tone, and then with the allusion, Cato the Younger on the obverse, an allusion to Tone's death. And at the time that this was presented to Matilda, they also presented a sword to her 16-year-old son, William, expressing the hope that with it he would one day avenge the wrongs of his country. And again, this was a really exacting the demands that was being made of Matilda and her family, because by 1806 she'd already lost 2 of her children to tuberculosis, and William had been beginning to show signs of the same disease. So she's being asked to yet make more sacrifices. And she did prove herself willing to resist some of those demands that were being made on her as a Republican widow when they came into conflict with the interests of her family. So in 1802, she tried to dissuade what she described as a strange collection of Irishmen in Paris from trying to recruit Tone's younger brother, Arthur, into schemes for renewed military expedition to Ireland. So she pled with them in vain that her children were young and helpless and really needed the protection of their uncle. And while her decision to allow her son William to embark on a military career partly fulfilled Irish Republicans' desire to see him follow in his father's footsteps, she also came into conflict with Napoleon's Minister for War, the Franco-Irish general Henri Jacques-Guillaume Clark, when he tried to have William enlisted into Napoleon's Irish Legion. And Matilda really wanted her son to go into a much more prestigious branch of the French military. She kind of looked down on the Irish Legion as a pretty ragged group of emigre soldiers. And again, she showed some real steel and some daring in trying to arrange a better career for William, and ambushed Napoleon's carriage when he was out hunting in the forest of Saint-Germain, and pleaded with him to support her son's naturalization as a French citizen so that he would be able to enter into the more prestigious French School of Cavalry. In 1817, Matilda would cross the Atlantic once again with her new husband, the Scottish lawyer Thomas Wilson, joining her son at Georgetown near Washington. And you can see here the elegant estate where she spent some of her early years in the US, Kalorama, and the home of the American diplomat Joe Barlow, who she had met and befriended in Paris. And in Georgetown, Matilda mixed with a well-established community of United Irish exiles that included the Belfast radical William Sampson, whose daughter Catherine William Tone would marry in 1825. So you can see this quite tight-knit community, but also this sense of the kind of continuity, generational continuity between these different groups within the United Irish exiled community. And of course, it was while she was in the States that I suppose Matilda's role as chief custodian and guardian of Wolfe Tone's memory would be most fully demonstrated when she published, edited and then published Wolfe Tone's his journal and memoirs in 1826, which was a collaboration with her son. And this, of course, was absolutely essential in ensuring Tone's legacy and exemplifies in some way the more engaged, the more active model of Republican widowhood that Matilda was able to pursue in the United States. And it's worth briefly contrasting that version of the Republican relict as a kind of active custodian and guardian of her husband's memory with the more passive model of the grief-stricken woman lamenting her fallen heroes that was prevalent in Ireland in the decades after the 1798 rebellion. So because open celebration of the United Irishmen still remained legally hazardous. Commemoration tended to be much more oblique, much more focused on feminine suffering than on masculine militarism. And that would be most fully embodied in the figure of Sarah Curran, fiancée of Robert Emmet, the executed leader of the 1803 rebellion. And Curran, after her doomed affair with Emmet and his execution, had married a British Army officer and travelled with him to the British garrison in Sicily, where she had died of tuberculosis, though of course the preferred explanation was that she had pined away from a broken heart. And in Thomas More's famous elegy on Curran, she is far from the land. She's portrayed as being in mournful exile in Sicily, her heart in Emmet's grave, singing a plaintive song to the memory of her dead lover. So it's this very sentimentalized depiction that really shows Curran as an eternal mourner, an emblem of the feminized nation, grieving her fallen martyrs. So that's quite a dominant, I suppose, representation of the women associated with the United Irishmen in Ireland in the first half of the 19th century. And it's one that this kind of model of the eternal mourner is one I think that Matilda tries to resist. She didn't want to be cast in the same mode as Sarah Curran. She would respond with indignation to an account of her life in Paris, published in the New Monthly magazine in 1825, which portrayed her as still immured in grief, her home a shrine to her dead husband and children. And the anonymous author of this account of a visit to Matilda believed that she had been reluctant to remarry, thinking it, quote, due to the memory of her husband that she should bear no other name. And describing a visit to Matilda on the eve of her wedding to Thomas Wilson in 1816, he wrote, quote, she happened to be alone, was unusually sad, and for the first time that I had seen her dressed in white. My eye passed involuntarily to the portrait of Tone, which hung immediately before her. She rose and retired in silence and in tears. And in a statement appended to the 1826 edition of Tone's life, Matilda vigorously rejected this mawkish portrait of her on the eve of the wedding. She said it was a hackneyed and commonplace scene. She insisted that she didn't own a white dress, had never noticed where the gentleman's eyes had glanced, and had certainly not left the room in tears. So she was really pushing back against this attempt to recast the details of her life as a sentimental fiction. But that said, she would, until the end of her life, continue to assert her status as the chief custodian and guardian of Tone's memory. So when Madden's monumental collective biography of the lives and times of the United Irishmen was published in 1842, she wrote to the New York Truth Teller newspaper to publicly correct what she felt were inaccuracies in Madden's account, and particularly what she felt was his suggestion that it was Tone who was primarily responsible for steering the movement in a more revolutionary direction. And she thought that these inaccuracies might have been not have been included if Madden had bothered to visit her when he was in the United States in the 1830s. So he interviewed a lot of United Irish exiles, but never bothered to visit Matilda, about which she was quite indignant. I'm doing time.
Yeah, I think
I should wrap it up.
I'm still wrapped up in your paper.
Well, I sound
Yeah, you could draw it to a close.
I just want to talk briefly then about towards the middle of the 19th century, especially as movements like Young Ireland are really beginning to champion and rediscover tone and champion this cult of tone. And of course, ahead of what would be a much more short-lived rising in 1848, they began a series in the Nation newspaper, the Young Ireland newspaper, on illustrious Irish women. And significantly, they began that series with a biography of Matilda Tone, published in weekly instalments over several weeks. And they said that the aim of this series was to place before our countrywomen a mirror in which they will see their true duties in the struggle for which Ireland is now preparing. And of course, the suggestion was here that what the women's role would be one of self-sacrifice, passive heroism, unwavering support for their menfolk. And in many ways, it provided, I think, for into the 19th and 20th centuries, quite a frustratingly limited template for Irish women's political action. Perhaps unfairly to Matilda Tone, who I think was a more interesting woman than this depiction suggests, but you can see this theme kind of resurfacing here in Helena Concannon's 1919 History of the Women of 98, where Matilda is listed amongst the wives of 98, the wife of Theobald Wolfe Tone, and of course it's dedicated to all the women who have given their loved ones to the cause of Ireland. And it continues in works like this. Is 1968. To the Irish rebels, they live in love in shadow of the gala, which has, of course, Matilda and Theobald Wolfe Tone bidding each other farewell as the cover. And it's partly because Matilda Tone filled the role of Republican relic so well that it remains difficult to see her as a figure in her own right, and to ask, as Rosamund Jacob asked, what she herself thought, and to see her as maybe something more than the rebel's wife. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Katrina, for a wonderful paper. What a useful chair. It turned out not that you have to watch the time yourself. And also my apologies for reversing the order. I did do that, you know. But you've been really patient. Ken, yes, a very experienced teacher and vice principal in County Down and
Downpatrick, yeah.
And Downpatrick. So has carried the flag for us, you know, all these years in the schools, but also has written extensively on the United Irishman, including during the bicentenary, editor with Myrtle Hill and Brian Turner of the 1798 rebellion in County Down, and his really excellent book on Samuel Neilson, the Belfast Jacobin. Samuel Neilson was the editor of the Northern Star, and a very, very important individual who's often been overlooked until your book. In fact, that was the first full book of Neilson, I think, wasn't it? Yeah. So thank you for that. And he's currently involved in researching a book on Northern informers between 1795 and 1798. You'll have a field day with that one. And you should go round I was very privileged. Collins, they're now Collins. So I was so late for the cemetery tour that I was given a special one by Colin, and we were the number of headstones that obviously were partially defaced of people associated with the United Irishmen, and I just wonder if you find any of the informers headstones, how many are going to be defaced as well, because they would have been very well known in local tradition. So Colin's your man if you need a special kind. But you're very welcome, Ken. Thank you.
Afternoon, everybody. I'd just like to echo the thanks that have been extended to Bill for organising today's conference. And I'm delighted, but also extremely daunted to be standing in front of such a august company. I too, Marianne, have brought my copy of the Tone biography with me, so I hope you will sign it for me a little bit later on. I'm delighted that Bill has brought everybody here to Belfast, my town, and the town of so many others here as well. And the talk really is going to be about Tone's relationships, and he was somebody who was capable of forming and sustaining relationships. I think strength of character is something that does come through. And certainly Belfast is somewhere that was very close, as someone has already said, to Tone's heart. And in his memoir, which is written in France in 1796, and with a palpable sense of absence making the heart grow fonder, I think, Theobald Wolfe Tone declared that the 3 weeks he spent in Belfast in October of 1791 were ones in which, I quote, I look back on as perhaps the most pleasantest of my life. Now, Tone's visit to Belfast was a very purposeful one. It was a chance to meet those advanced political radicals that were known to him only by reputation. He found the town very much to his liking. Belfast was small and compact. It was industrious, it was self-confident, and very importantly, I think, it was convivial. With one public house for approximately every 17 of the adult population, Tone enjoyed the hospitality, and his journal recalls late nights, and I think we all know some of these quotes. A great deal of general politics and wine. Rise again with a headache. Generally drunk, broke my glass, banging it on the table. Home. God knows how or when. Waken drunk. Interestingly as well, and not without some irony in 2023, Tone also commented on how cheap the prices were in Belfast. Now, Tone was coming north to a town of around about 18,300 people, the birthplace of the Volunteers back in 1778, whose most progressive citizens sympathised with the extension of greater rights to Catholics as far back as 1783. A time where familial and denominational ties with those in the vanguard of the American Revolution meant that terms such as representation, citizenship, and natural rights were very much part of the political lexicon in this town. And it was an overwhelmingly Presbyterian town. Two of the churches in Rosemary Lane did not subscribe to the Westminster Confession of Faith, the first congregation having been served by the Reverend Thomas Drennan, whose son William conceived the idea of a reform society that embraced genuine and inclusive reform with an emphasis on the greatest happiness of the greatest number. And we heard about William Drennan from Stephen and Aaron this morning. In 1791, members of this church, the first church, can still be visited today, included later United Irishmen such as William Tennant and Thomas McCabe. But it was not just what we sometimes refer to as the New Lights, which embraced political innovation in Belfast at that particular time. The Reverend Sinclair Kelburn ministered the third Trinitarian congregation, whose members included the Brysons, the Biggers, the Nielsen's, the Sims, and the McCrackens, all of whom would be prominent United Irishmen. The Presbyterians, of course, rejected ecclesiastical hierarchy. They promoted individual relationships with God through a thorough reading of Scripture. The town's literacy levels were higher than many other urban centres, with a reading society that had artisan and journeyman roots, but which evolved into the Belfast Society for promoting knowledge. There was also a philanthropic spirit in the town that promoted the principle of urban improvement. Now, of course, as we know, Belfast was a closed corporation borough, with the two MPs very much in the pocket of the landowner, the Marquis of Donegal. So there was this improving Presbyterian mercantile class that might have been assigned its place, but it refused to accept it. As events unfolded in France in 1789, there was a seismic shift against what had once been considered the natural order of things. Attacks upon a monopolistic ruling class and a state church resonated with many of the politically disenfranchised. And Tom Paine's Rights of Man, which Tone dubbed the Quran of Belfast, was purchased individually or, interestingly, read collectively. With interest in reform politics revived, the volunteers of Belfast were once again on the march. And it was into this environment that Tone came and was welcomed enthusiastically by many of the town's citizens in 1791. He observed in his journal the Presbyterians that he met there. His fellow travellers were, and I quote, all steady, sensible, clear men, and as I judge, extremely well adapted for serious business. In a later quotation from his memoir, remember written in 1796, when the circumstances have changed, as Oltan told us this morning, the dissenters of the north, he wrote, and especially from the town of Belfast, are, from the genius of their religion and from the superior diffusion of political information among them, sincere and enlightened republicans. That's a quotation that deserves some qualification, I think, given the shift in time. But let's not get carried away. Tone also observed that these Belfast radicals were ignorant of Catholics and of the Catholic Committee. Traditional doctrinal suspicions prevailed, and Tone would later note that he had to work hard to convert even some of the more advanced radicals in the town. While Tone was shaped by Belfast influences, he also shaped Belfast, challenging old prejudices and acting as a persuader for a form of politics which, while not altogether new in embracing parliamentary reform and the removal of sectarian divisions, it was innovative in highlighting that Catholics were in fact capable of political liberty and not slaves to what Tone himself would have referred to at times as superstition and priestcraft. The French Revolution, even at this early stage, had unlocked the sectarian stalemate that had meant that politics had, and the term was used earlier today, had frozen from those heady days of the 1780s. With what was happening in France occurring as dramatically as it was now all to play for. Tone was a man of the European Enlightenment, interested in classical thinking, rationality and progress. He was informed about international affairs and he embraced a deistic outlook that was not likely to sit well with some of the northern Presbyterians. But Tone was also quintessentially Irish, focused on the perceived injustices, the real injustices of Anglican elitism, and on what he considered to be the usurping of Ireland's political destiny by the English influence. Tone tapped into a very strong anti-Anglican sentiment in Belfast, but he also had to convince Presbyterians that Catholics were fit for liberty. And it's at this point that Tone's relationships in the town provide the influence he needed to effectuate his plans. So if we think about some of the influences on Tone in Belfast, in that first visit especially, in October 1791. The figures here, of course, on the left, his great friend and confidant, Thomas Russell, and on the right, Thomas Digges, in fact, an American. So these influences are, in fact, people who were only temporarily resident in Belfast. So after their meeting in the gallery of the House of Commons in 1790, Tone and Russell became, as we know, firm friends. And in Tone's memoir, he makes numerous references to just how close that personal relationship was. Even when Tone is in France, there's almost a sense in which, what would Russell do? What would Russell be advising me when he was just about to go to meet Lazare Carnot, just days, weeks after arriving in France? Oh, I wish Russell was with me now. And this was a friendship that was incredibly close, and their discussions, I think, created a pretty unique political synergy. That idyllic summer in Irish Town in 1790 ended when Russell was assigned to the 64th Regiment of Foot and posted to Belfast. Tone, in many respects the aspiring soldier himself, I think seemed more interested in Russell's uniform than in his destination. But Russell's deployment was educational for him, and Tone became familiar with the political and religious dynamics through their communications. Even when Russell was in Belfast, he was talking to Tone, he was communicating with Tone about the personalities, the political ideas, the political obstacles that were presented there. When Tone drafted the resolutions for the events in Belfast to commemorate the 2nd anniversary of the storming of the Bastille, the 3rd, as we heard earlier, relating to reform that would include the Catholics, well, it touched a nerve in the town, and so the issue was fudged. And it was at this stage that Tone wrote about becoming a red-hot Catholic, and he began to address the concerns of those descendants of Scottish and English settlers who traditionally viewed Catholics with suspicion, not just because Presbyterians often regarded Catholics as slaves to an external power, but closer to home, they viewed Catholics as being desirous of a return to traditional land ownership. So while Tone famously published his argument on behalf of the Catholics of Ireland in August of 1791, his audience was the northern dissenter. Tone was informed and influenced by Russell's intimate knowledge of the town. In his own scribbled journal, months before an argument on behalf of the Catholics of Ireland was published, Russell challenged the common objections against any reform that would benefit Catholics. I'll temporarily move on to this. I do have a copy of Russell's jottings and diaries at home. I thought about these frequently as I was giving feedback to my own students on their essays, and I was sort of convinced that my handwriting was not the worst that anybody could have come across. Now, Russell did communicate to Tone the concerns that tended to be quite common in Presbyterian Belfast. First of all, the sheer number of Catholics that there were. Also, the sense in which they were attached to a foreign dispensing ecclesiastical power, Russell's words that he would have heard people putting forward the argument about in the town. A mutation of property if Catholics were empowered, and also the concerns that there would be future religious conflict. Now, Russell addressed these in turn in his own journal, and while Tone's argument showcased his very considerable gift for pamphleteering, and Tone was a wonderful writer, he was relying on Russell's identification of a northern myopia as far as Catholics were concerned. And the two men were together, personally together, in the summer of 1791, during which I think Russell's influence on Tone's philosophy was at its zenith. Tone had been forewarned and was intellectually forearmed. Tone's approach was to celebrate the attack on the Catholic Church in France in his argument, and this allowed Presbyterians to speculate about the potential asset of, I think Presbyterians were hoping for Catholics who were lapsing. Now, Presbyterian dissenters would never have lapsed in their mind from their own particular faith, but they were more than happy for others to do so. Go back to the slide again and think about another influence in Belfast, and that was the American Thomas Atwood Digges. He was a friend and neighbour of George Washington. The two lived on opposite sides of the Potomac River. And Digges is an interesting character historically. He was variously a political go-between. He was an industrial pirate. He was somebody who aroused the suspicions of none other than Benjamin Franklin, who regarded Digges as a scoundrel at best. He was also no stranger to a prison cell, but Digges features regularly in Tone's 1791 journal. During walks, breakfasts and dinners with Digges during his 3-week stay in the town, Tone's thinking was undoubtedly shaped, for Digges offered an American perspective, an experience of declaring independence from London, the taking of arms against the king. Tone's ideas were already distilling, of course, and can be detected in his 1790 pamphlet, Spanish War. But Digges offered a perspective that Tone could file away somewhere for a little bit later on, namely that Ireland had potentially the capacity for independence, and that this would be achievable by the integration of the sects. Nothing new here, but crucially, that for any chance of success, England needed to be distracted by war, with the possibility that France would be sympathetic to any attempt to subvert English influence in Ireland, or anywhere else for that matter. Digges' thoughts, supported by the United Irishman entrepreneur William Sinclair, about whom we heard earlier, were, and again we're quoting, "If Ireland were free and well governed, being that she is unencumbered with debt, she would, in arts, commerce, and manufacturing, spring up like an air balloon and leave England behind her at an immense difference. There is no computing the rapidity with which she would rise." Well, this almost Swiftian economic analysis, Jonathan Swift, not Taylor, was not new. But in 1791, it tapped into Tone's thinking. Tone probed Digges on the extent to which the nascent United Irishman reflected the American committee that drew up the Declaration of Independence. And he was affirmed by Digges' response. Now, the story for Digges doesn't end terribly well. He was arrested in Glasgow after stealing pieces of muslin on a shopping trip. Tone would later refer to Digges in his diary as the hero of my last journal, suggesting a degree of influence. And I think Digges did influence Tone in terms of the trajectory of the United Irishman, and he added an international perspective that other figures were less likely to have. In Belfast, Tone would be influenced by others, those early members of the Society of United Irishmen. I think he would be influenced by these figures, he would be educated by them, and he would be frequently annoyed by them as well, right through to his departure from these shores in June of 1795. Tone's journals do refer to people like McCabe and Sinclair, and also Robert and William Sims, the latter respected for their financial generosity as well as their political activism. Unsurprisingly, Samuel Neilson, whose portrait is here and also here on the walls of Clifton House, this Belfast cotton merchant was a major influence on Tone. He was a member of the first Belfast Volunteer Company, the Green Company, as it was called. His commanding officer was Captain Waddell Cunningham, about whom more a little later, and Cunningham was known to be opposed to Catholic relief. Now, Neilson's role as one of the leading organisers and strategists of the United Irishmen is documented. Neilson was actually in Dublin on the 21st of May, 1791. That's the day that Drennan sends his famous letter to, I think it was to Sam Matera and Martha Fergus, talking about this new political club. Neilson was in Drennan's company that morning. And I don't think that's a coincidence. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the letter was sent and it talked about the setting up of a new political club. It was also Neilson who was taking the lead for the establishment of the Northern Star newspaper. And the Star newspaper was planned, and its prospectus was written before Tone's visit to Belfast. In other words, this club was very much in embryonic form, and perhaps even further than that. I think it's also interesting as well, and again, this was mentioned this morning at the talk, that Tone talks about Neilson as the Jacobin. He does tend to give little nicknames to people, and most of the nicknames assigned by Tone to people in Belfast referred to their trade, to their occupation. Neilson is different. He wasn't called Cotton. He was called the Jacobin. And I think there's a very, very definite reason for that. And as the first meeting was due to be held on the 18th of October, 1791, Tone was invited to Neilson's for dinner. They spent 2 hours discussing the project, and they made their way to the first meeting. Now, there's no record of that conversation. Would love to be a fly on the wall in so many ways, but I suspect that what Neilson was doing was saying to the visitor to Belfast, to a club that was already in the planning, this is how it's going to be, Mr. Tone. You have to listen to these Belfast voices. And it was Neilson who actually reminded Tone that Belfast, or sections of Belfast, would have been in favour of granting political rights to Catholics as far back as 1783. So the town's radicalism, I think, is demonstrable. Tone had only recently come to see the potential of the northern dissenters, and Nielsen's influence is not just extended to what happened in 1791, but he's also trying to influence the outworkings and the deliberations of the Catholic Convention in December 1792. He meets with Luke Teeling, one of the elected representatives to the Catholic Convention, and tries to tell Teeling, here are your instructions from the Presbyterians of Belfast. He then gets really stroppy with Tone and the leading Catholic Richard McCormick because he feels that the northern influence has been frozen out. Later, as we move into 1792, it's Nielsen who discovers Waddell Cunningham's attempt to slightly derail the resolutions that are being prepared for the political meeting that would be held after the volunteer review in the White Linen Hall. Nielsen it was who later went to Dublin to advise his United Irish colleagues there to adopt a more cellular and confidential structure in May 1794, much to their bewilderment. Now, Nielsen, of course, was at the centre of Tone's farewells in Belfast in the summer of 1795, climbing the Cave Hill, picnicking in the Deer Park, and also camping on Ram's Island, again reference to Martin's project next year. When Tone departed, Nielsen and the Belfast set acted quickly, and if we are to believe the deposition offered by William Hart of Carrickfergus, by August 1795, as Tone is on his way to the States, Nielsen had communicated with the French National Assembly. Russell had been given the command of the United Irish military structure in Ulster. Arms were being procured, and 10,000 men had been recruited across counties Antrim and Down. Tone would have left Ireland in no doubt about the serious influence of the Belfast leadership. The self-styled Committee of General Welfare, note the term, to the developing project. I want to flip the issue now. This is coming to the end of what I want to say. Flipping the issue here in some respects to suggest that it was those people in Belfast who were opposed to increasing political rights for Catholics who also influenced Tone's thinking. Waddell Cunningham on the left of the screen, Henry Joy, cousin of Henry Joy McCracken, editor of the Belfast newsletter, and also at the top, the Reverend William Bruce, who was the minister of what had been Thomas Drennan's Conversation first, and also was the principal of the Belfast Academy. So, what are we at here? These cautious Presbyterians were reflective of the membership of the Northern Whig Club. Bruce, Dr. Alexander Halliday, Henry Joy Jr., refusing to get carried away by notions of enfranchisement and Catholic emancipation. These men were not altogether reactionary, and they did leave an imprint on the town of Belfast, not least here in the Charitable Society. But for Tone, their sentiments were recalcitrant and out of date, more in tune with Lord Charlement's famous reluctance to touch the Catholic question back in the 1780s. Now stationed in Belfast, of course, and drawn into the radical circle, Russell, as we know, had informed Tone of the opposition of these powerful and influential members of Belfast life. And as we've seen, Russell's jottings contained arguments that were listed to prompt discussion with Tone and subsequently elaborated on Russell's rebuttal of these excuses, and then Tone's argument on behalf of the Catholics. On the 21st of October, Tone tells us from his diaries that at dinner at Henry Joy's house, there was, and I quote, an amazing battle over dinner on the Catholic issue, with Joy continuing to probe the issues that Tone felt he had actually already addressed in his pamphlet. Some people were not listening. Joy was, he said, an artful and troublesome antagonist who agreed with the principle of liberating Catholics, but balked at the expediency. The following day, there are more arguments at the home of James Ferguson, another member of the Northern Whig Club. Bruce, Halliday and Cunningham were also there, And again, in Tone's journal, Halliday was pleasant, everyone else stupid. On the 25th, there was another sparring match, this time at the home of Sam and Martha Mateer, a 2-hour debate with Waddell Cunningham, Robert Holmes, and William Bruce. Writing in his diary, Bruce, an intolerant high priest. Bruce set out his objections to Catholic rights at some length and was supported by Cunningham, Thomas Gregg, Robert Holmes, and Henry Joy Jr. Their opposition was demonstrated publicly in a meeting in Belfast in January of 1792, during which Halliday declared that while he had supported the principle of Catholic rights, he thought they were not prepared for it. They must be farther enlightened and less under the dominion of the priesthood. In July, Tone's second visit to Belfast, Waddell Cunningham was spooked by the Dubliners' presence. Tone was getting exasperated and observed wryly how, and I quote, "the hair of Dr. Halliday's wig grows grey with fear of the Catholics." On the eve of the 3rd anniversary of the fall of the Bastille, Nielsen uncovered a plot. Cunningham was trying to convert the country volunteers so that they will vote against the pro-Catholic resolutions the following day. Referring to Cunningham in his diary as a lying old scoundrel, Tone predicted hot work the next day. Now, in the end, the resolutions were carried. The moderates lost the debate. Only Joy, later referred to by Tone as a cur, Cunningham and 3 others opposed the resolutions. Now, that Tone and his allies had won the argument was due to the briefings and the preemptive discussions that disarmed the opposition. So overall, Tone's political thinking was well developed, but still developing, and his political trajectory would be shaped by his own analysis, later by external circumstances, such as the outbreak of war between Britain and France in 1793, an absolute game changer, and by the dashed hopes of reform after the recall of Viceroy Fitzwilliam in February 1795. Tone's political principles were becoming oven-ready, but there were, of course, other influences that offered a more nuanced, and in the case of Belfast, a more localised vision. Tone was a learner, always prepared to listen, embrace, or indeed reject the analyses of others. Now, while he embraced the radical sentiments espoused by many in the town, I would suggest that in some respects, it was those who are sometimes and often considered to be the anti-heroes of Belfast politics, Joy, Bruce, Cunningham, and a great many others, who were among those who unwillingly pushed Tone hardest to make an intellectual case for radical change. Thank you.
Then what do you want to do about the timing? Can we run for 5 minutes into Tommy's time? Just take a couple of questions. It's all right, I'm going to skip. Does anybody want to ask it? 3 wonderful papers, which the chair didn't stop in time because they were so good. So there won't be many questions, Jim.
Yeah, you don't never have to joy. Don't call these people the time, and their position, the public position was, yes, the Catholic will not manipulation, but right? No, obviously in that sense. But if you look at Joy, Henry Joy, and what he says, he basically says that the papers are the same everywhere and always. Says this. So then, what follows from that logically is the right time will never arrive. You know, because they're ultimately incorrigible, and using words like incorrigible. So you can get them so far, you're not going to get them.
Yeah, I think that's a fair analysis. I think certainly, all of these people who did influence Tone in a sort of unwitting way and an unwilling way were progressive in some respects, and as I said, they all did leave an imprint on the town in terms of reform politics, in terms of donations, in terms of philanthropy, in terms of education, and so on. But I think there were absolutely, those prejudices You know, the sense that Catholics were not ready for political liberty, despite what was happening in France. The sense in which, you know, there would be a very palpable danger in terms of, you know, turning back the clock in terms of land ownership and so on. And there are all sorts of rivalries over jobs and land, particularly with the relaxation of the penal laws in places like County Armagh, for example, as you've demonstrated. Is it likely that that was a line that was never going to be crossed? I think for some, yes, it was. And I think within Presbyterian theology or aspects of Presbyterian theology, the French Revolution was welcomed because it was almost predicting, you know, what was written in the Book of Revelation. And some Presbyterians, and not just of the New Life persuasion, but for some, you know, more old life Presbyterians, like the Reverend Birch in Saintfield, for example, they are preaching very powerful sermons, basically saying, right, lads, get your best clothes on, get ready, because anytime now, you know, we're going to see what has been predicted in Revelation. So I think scripturally, there's a sense in which, you know, Catholics, both, you know, in religious terms and in political terms, were not ready. And some of the statements we look back on in 2023, it's, you know, it's cringeworthy. But I think that was the reality of some strands of Presbyterian thinking at the time. So I think, yeah.
All right, shall we move on to the roundtable discussion? And I hope you don't mind, we're not going to take a break, so we can just move right through this. I hope everybody's okay with that. I'm going to introduce Tommy Graham, who many of you might already know. Tommy is the lead editor of History Ireland, the famous quarterly history newsletter that bi-monthly, sorry, bi-month 6 times a year, and you all should subscribe to. He's going to be the chair of a collection of the presenters that you'll see today, and it will be Tommy is a well-skilled hand at this, so I'm going to turn it over to him.
Thank you, Bill.
Do you want to call your members up?
Yeah, there's Olga. And
sometimes you've heard in court.
where's Marianne gone? She disappeared.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
Nice meeting you.
Can
Will you be so kind as to sit at the round table?
I just said tomorrow again.
No, you wouldn't be so honest.
Mother, you might meet together sometime in Dublin tomorrow. Maybe phone you later on.
Yeah, but let's see.
I don't know, right there.
Sorry.
Okay, you could work on some first. Great. Oh, I'm sorry.
Get more anxious.
Okay, let's get started. First of all, I'd just like to thank Bill for organising this event. And it's a great pleasure to be back in Belfast, the Athens of the North. By the way, this is where the History Ireland project was conceived in the various. You mentioned, what was it, one pub for every 17 person? It was like that in 1991 as well. And that's we're commemorating or celebrating our 30th birthday this year, by the way. Now, just to explain the ground rules here, my job here is to ask a few difficult questions to people on the panel. Don't relax too much, because we're not just going to have a Q&A session at the end. At any stage, if you want to make a contribution, just put your hand up. If you disagree violently with something that the speakers say, and we have a do you want to
for the panel? Some people are struggling to hear.
Oh, I see. Okay. Okay. Yeah. So, and I may call on 1 or 2 people on particular points. Basically, what I'm saying is nobody in this room is safe in this discussion. Now, it's a while since I studied this period, and it was like reacquainting oneself with old friends. I have to say, what I found most innovative was your paper, Katrina, on Matilda Tone, right? Now, I noticed that quotation that you put up on the screen there from Tone himself, in referring to his wife. He said, "On every occasion in my life, I consulted her." Should that not be more accurate to be on every occasion when I was around, I consulted her? I mean, Jim Smith earlier talked about Tone's habit of quoting Shakespeare. Well, he emulated Shakespeare in other ways. You know, as soon as his career started, he left the wife and kids behind and headed off to the big city. Any comment on that?
No, it's very good point. And of course, you know, reading the journals, they're full of these wonderful tributes to Matilda, but at the same time, you're reading them thinking, you've just left her, abandoned her with like 3 young kids, you know, with no sense of, you know, where the future will lead. And it is interesting that it becomes, I think, in the 19th century, their conservative critics of Tone will point to that and say, you know, how could he have abandoned his wife and children like this? You know, this is not an honourable person. This was, you know, despite his kind of self-presentation as a doting husband and father, he actually treated them pretty shabbily. You could say that. I mean, I suppose, but as you say, that sense of, if we believe that this is a Republican partnership and that Matilda was invested in the project, which of course is hard to know because you don't have, you know, much from her during that particular period. But, you know, if we believe that, then I suppose that puts a different spin on it, that it was something that they were collectively invested in. But yeah, no, it is certainly open to alternative interpretations.
Marion, can I bring you in on this? My question is, in all this period, did Tone ever play away from home, as it were? I know he had an affair with the wife of Richard Martin, better known as Humanity Dick Martin, also known as Hair Trigger Martin. So that was a fairly perilous enterprise he's involved in.
Tone was just behaving like an 18th century man, essentially. And
18th century.
I looked very hard to see whether any of these. He was a terrible flirt, and well, the two pictures we have of him, he wasn't particularly handsome, but women found him handsome. You know, women really liked him, and I think it was because of his liveliness and his, you know, he wasn't ugly, but he wasn't particularly handsome. And I looked very hard when I was writing to him to see whether he did any of the affairs, because he was a terrible flirt, and he did fall madly in love with Eliza Martin. I didn't find any evidence or get the impression that it actually reached to carnal intimacy. They kind of put her on a pedestal, and when she was revealed as being a little bit loose, there was a big court case, as you know, and he was heartbroken that, you know, this person that he idolized, that he put on a pedestal, behaved so, and he would not believe. She was cited in a criminal conversation case, and it was all over the newspapers, as you will maybe will have come across. And he takes her part. He doesn't believe that she was as kind of loose as was making out. But I think he did actually play a bit looser when he was training as a barrister in London. I'm fairly sure that he did. He didn't fall in love with the person, but I think he did. But I do have to say that it's very often the case, you know, because they had a good marriage, that as the marriage went on, there is no sign at all of him having affairs. He could have done in Paris, but there's no sign at all. And also the last thing is that, and I think you were absolutely right about this. Mattie Tone was much tougher French has been given credit for. And I think she was tough with him as well. I don't think she let him away with anything, even though he eloped with her when she was only, what, 16 or 17. But I think if there was anything really going on, I think she torn strips of him. That's the impression I got.
So you're saying that he might have been up to something in London, but
Yeah.
at that stage, he would have fallen under the ambit of the time zone rule. You know, the infidelity is okay if it's in a different time zone, because there was a different time zone in London at that time. Ulton, I want to move on to you on a question. This question of how the ideas of the French Revolution were disseminated, right? Because there's been no mention here today, I'm sure there will be over the weekend, of the defenders, right? I mean, their origin was in Armagh, sectarian dispute with the Peep of Day boys, who then eventually morphed into the Orange Order. And years ago, defenders were usually dismissed as simply a sectarian Catholic organisation. And I know Jim Smith has since rehabilitated them. They kind of spread, they tended to shift like a chameleon. They've shifted geographically into North Leinster and into Dublin. And Jim, of course, came up with that very exotic species, the Protestant defender in Dublin. And basically what I'm getting at is, would it be incorrect to see the United Irishmen as the sole vectors of the ideas of the French Revolution?
No, I think you're spot on, Tommy, that there is definitely, as you say, the defenders are a very, very diverse movement. Some of whom are, I think, Jim, this is your phrase, Catholic nationalists, and some of whom fit very, very well within the revolutionary, democratic, secular, internationalist, French-style republicanism. And the two are mixed, and also, obviously, the defenders are about material conditions and tithes and rents and all the rest of it. So there is definitely, I think, an ideological dispersion and diffusion amongst the defenders and also by the defenders. And partly that comes from newspapers, partly it comes from the sixpenny packets of sedition, as the loyalist newspapers describe the bundles of pamphlets from Thomas Paine and other people that are left at the crossroads for people to pick up. And partly it comes from people discussing things amongst themselves. And so we have these, as you know, these oaths or whatever, that sometimes are confused, but sometimes aren't, and are very clear in their sort of revolutionary intention. So I agree the defenders are absolutely important. Obviously today has been focused on Tone, and we know he has connections with them around 1792. Sorry, I realise I'm rambling and you want the mic back.
No.
But you know, so it's not as though he's completely ignorant of the defenders. When he's kicking around Rathfriland and stuff, he's clearly negotiating with defenders, who are themselves, if we remember, by late 1792, opening negotiations, it looks like, with the French. I think, Marianne, you mentioned that, in Partners in Revolution. So again, that reinforces
Just
the diversity of them.
Yeah, that point.
Yes, I found that out a long time ago, that the defenders weren't just a rabble of Catholic peasants, that they did have members, you know, in Paris already. Tone was negotiating with them in Rathfriland. I don't think, do we have the names of the ones that he was talking to in Rathfriland? But because by the time he'd gone over to France, he was getting very angry at the French misunderstanding the defenders. The French thought that they could, well, they were thinking of them as a bit of a rabble, and that if they could kind of somehow get help to the defenders would just create havoc in Ireland. And Tone, you can see it, you know, in his Paris, in all the papers in Paris, and indeed in his journals, he was getting absolutely apoplectic about this, which suggests that he had spoken quite closely with some of the defenders in Ireland before he left. So he already understood that.
Yeah, Jim Smith was, I mean, you just, use the mic here, so I think this has been recorded, guys, so, keep it going, Jim.
When Tone was in Belfast in May, June, 75, they had an honest living basis. And it's one of the, I would say, one of the key meetings that he held was with George Keeling.
Yes,
And and that was, yeah, that's really when
yeah.
they had their connections up to that point, right? But I think it was the point when they actually sealed the deal in that month. And when Tone is in New Jersey, he writes a letter to Russell and he says, I hope that young fella is getting on. It's clearly Keeling that he's referring to. So, I mean, it's in the works, I think, since '92, but it's whose visit here is pivotal. That's when they're getting down to.
Just as actually to Barry, and I can correct this as well. There's a comment attributed to Wellington Africa, posthumously about Tone marveling at his ability to achieve so much, with everything stacked against him, to raise this relationship with the French, to negotiate. Shockingly, he's saying, you know, admiring the skill sets in terms of what he's done with so little. This is a comment that floats around. Is it accurate? People know otherwise in this, but it speaks to something inaccurate, but the toolbox he had of skill sets to negotiate with people at that high level, but feeling also that there was a low level with defenders, but being able to, whether it was legal training or innate skill, but to actually have the wit to deal with difficult situations and with so little in terms of resources at his fingertips to achieve much.
Tone was extraordinary when he got to France. He really was extraordinary, the way that he, within a few months, was able to get to the very, you know, top of the French directory. So there definitely, but he was a little bit surprised himself. I thought, and you're quite right. I can't remember the quotation, but when Lazare, the top general in France, this was before Napoleon Bonaparte, you know, risen to the top. Lazare was the top general, the one that led the Ventre Day expedition, and Tone was brought to meet him. And it was then, I think it was after that meeting, that Tone said, oh my goodness, what I have achieved so far. Because he has surprised himself. He keeps saying that he doesn't have very good French, but he must have had it good enough that he could make his way out. So yes, he does say that. So when you're saying, does he have very good skills at negotiation? Yes, he does. And I don't know, Jim, if when he first went, I think Sam Nielsen went with him, didn't he, down to the talks between the defenders and the Peter Day boys in Raffle Island, and they were extremely successful then. The first time they went, it was only when the local gentry, ascendancy gentry, that were there the next time that they were kind of run out of time. But certainly the small group that had gone down from Belfast were very successful that time.
You said that we did go out again.
Just take the mic there, Jim, so we, yeah.
You said earlier that we got against the Raphael.
I've forgotten.
I don't think so, but what I do remember is a crack brain priest.
Yes.
Was one of the people. He crack brain priest.
But he doesn't negotiate with him, the priest was trying to cause trouble, yes, yeah.
Jason, bring on the mic there. Sorry. Just hold on, slow down 1 second, just wait for the mic.
Sorry, do you know?
Hi there, folks. You're talking about defenders there, and I think it's very easy to space defenders as counter to the Orange Order. So the Orange Order was very sectarian, as we all know, when it included Protestants, right? The defenders were much different. Up in the north here, you have James Burns, the man who fired the cannon in the Battle of Antrim. He was Presbyterian. He was a defender. William Moore's cousin, William Moore, who was sent to Australia, he was a defender. You go down to the archives, you go down to the rebellion papers. Many Presbyterians were administering oaths and tried for administering defenders oath. Those were not United Irishmen administering the defenders oath. They were defenders. So I don't think they should be pigeonholed as a.
Just pass the mic up here to Sylvie.
No, I just
No,
wanted
just wait for
to,
the mic, Sylvie, just
thank you.
the conch.
Thank you. Sorry to sort of internationalize it a little bit. So on the point of Tone negotiating, as you know, Marianne, he arrives at a very important time when French military strategy is evolving. So possibly someone is less able than him would have also been successful because it suited them. What's extremely interesting is how he deconstructs the Irish, demography and the people who are likely to support the French. And he spins, there's a few little spins on this. He even writes at one stage in the diary, in this I lied. So we know the reality. But the French are a little bit alarmed. Delacroix, the Minister for External Relations, when he's relaying what's happening in Philadelphia and Tone's on his way over, he's on the boat. He says, this isn't really looking like it's going to reassure a French Republican government that we have to go to Ireland to defend Catholics. Now, eventually they do understand the religious demography of Ireland. They're far more interested. Will you pick up a gun? Are you willing to fight alongside us? Really, they don't verbalize it, but are you an anti-monarchist? Do you want a country? So that leads me back to something, and I was discussing this informally with Alton on the landing there. I'm half French, and the concept, which I perfectly understand, that the Irish, particularly here, were looking to France as a Catholic nation that had embraced liberty, maybe not 1789, but as they bit by bit begin building political institutions. The beginning of the French Revolution was really a political revolution. And they were rebuilding institutions and slowly granting citizenship, natural rights to people, and removing religious identity from civic life, from the civic life of males and tax-paying males who could then vote. So I think that's the most important. And to say that it was a Catholic nation that it was embracing, it's a little bit of an Irish solution to an Irish problem. Because many of you have spoken about the education about the 18th century. And I think not enough people are getting a broader vision of Enlightenment culture. France had been, just like England, had been secularized much, much, much earlier. And the influence of the philosophers, even just to pluck Voltaire and Rousseau out of the sky. Remember, Rousseau was not a Catholic. To many, he was an outsider, and that's the whole point. I think they had moved on and they were much riper for modernism, for something that we would recognize. Anyway, that's great.
No, just going back to Frank's point about the quote from Wellington, that went something like this. He said, and he wrote it in the context of when Tone's stories were published. He said, this man came to France with 100 guineas in his pocket. No, nobody, and came close to changing the destiny of Europe. So that's pretty good.
And it was a work of genius.
Yeah.
And that was one of his biggest adversaries, right?
Ken, yeah.
The magic box is all.
Oh. The microphone's still working out.
Oh yeah, the microphone's
maybe come back to the Rathisland episode in 1792. Tone and John Keogh and Nielsen had met with Valentine Derry, who was a leading County Louth defender. I think he's been sworn in actually by James Quigley. Alexander Lowry, who was Presbyterian, who lived in Linden Hill, and I think was one of those figures who was United Irishman, defender, United Irishman. Lowry, very young, I think he's probably in his late teens at that time. The Reverend Ty, who was the Anglican minister, and also Samuel Barber, who was the minister of First Presbyterian in Rathrisland. But going back to Jim's initial point, I think, and certainly when I'm teaching this, or was teaching this to A-level students, for me, one of the most dramatic themes of this period is one of politicization. And I think the defenders were politicizing very, very rapidly during this period. Russell refers to, defenders with French connections in 1792-93, the potential for importation of arms at that particular time as well. And the Catholic Convention itself was one of the most remarkable politicizing agents. You know, these were elections at micro level. People like John McGuinness in County Down, who was the self-styled Grand Master of the Defenders, was one of those elected as a delegate to the Catholic Convention. So too Luke Teeling, who was father of Charles Teeling, and also Father Bartholomew Teeling, who happened to be in the same Masonic lodge as Samuel Nielsen, and Henry Munro, who was at Ballynahinch in 1798. So I think that period of politicization, helped by newspapers, helped by the antagonism towards the raising of the militia regiments. And I think as well as that, what you've got is that sort of nexus between leading United Irishmen, such as Nielsen, Russell, McCracken, and certainly for us in this part of the world, a figure that not everybody will have heard of, but James Hope. You know, they are constantly working with the Defenders. People like Charles Teeling before his arrest in 1796, people like Bernard Coyle in Lurgan, who is a significant employer of around about 100 men in his Muslim factory. Robert Campbell, you know, the connections are most definitely there, and critically, the documentary evidence to support that is there. But you know, the notions of the Defenders as a sort of you know, agrarian society. Marianne, Jim, and most recently Timothy Murda in his new book on artisans in Germany, a fantastic read for anybody who hasn't looked at it. Give us a much more sophisticated picture, and I think we are learning more day and daily about what's happening in Ulster and Ireland in terms of you know, the preparation for the battle.
Can I just add briefly to that? You all referred, particularly you, to Russell. Now, we don't know enough about Russell because he didn't write much, and his writing is indecipherable, and we don't know much about him. But he was a man of very much more advanced opinions than Tone, and Tone was utterly influenced by him. And Russell was moving amongst working people who would have become Defenders. He was very respected by him. And Martha McTeer actually writes about him, how worried she is that he's mixing with, for want of a better word, these lower classes.
She fancied them, didn't she?
Sorry?
She fancied them.
Oh, I don't know.
Yes.
That's Marianne McCracken.
Oh, sorry, wrong one.
It's nonsense, I think.
That's Marianne McCracken.
Yeah.
Sorry, wrong one.
But I mean, Russell, unlike Tone, was phenomenally handsome. Everybody writes about it. When I was writing about what Tone's friendship was like with Russell, my American editor contacted me and said, did these two have a gay relationship?
It's always asked that.
I said, but it was published by Yale University Press. And this American editor lived actually in Paris. She'd been Samuel Beckett's, one of Samuel Beckett's editors, so I really respected her. I said, oh no, no way. She said, well, I suggest that you take some of those passages out of your book. How would I have defended Wolfe Tone being gay? Because he was certainly, definitely not, I tell you that much. But Russell was that kind of person. And yes, when you read Martha McTeer or Marianne McCracken, or the way people talked about Russell, and he definitely was, like Henry John McCracken, was mixing with people who were Defenders, and he would have influenced them, definitely.
Well, that's how he got the nickname, the man from God knows where. He'd walk from Dublin to Belfast or the other way and just wander into people's homes. You know? I mean, I think it was Russell then he spotted this young girl walking across the Moor Mountain somewhere. And then when he comes up to her, she's a copy of the North, just kind of under her arm. I mean, it's an amazing picture, you know. Continue. Can I just come back here just to Matilda here, right? Because I was rereading Marianne's book. I want my copy signed as well, by the way. Sorry. It's this period where it was 1790-91, where there's again the threesome. There's Tone, Russell, and Matilda and it sounds like a great time. They're just kind of doing, just chanting, and they're kind of. It just sounds reminding me of my student days. No responsibilities in particular, right? Did Matilda ever talk about that, or about about those periods when she was with her husband?
It's a good question, actually. I'm just trying to reflect back. I'm looking at Marianne now, on whether that, I mean, obviously she's publishing, she's editing, she's publishing the journals where he does, but again, there's little of her own writing where she seems to be specifically reflecting on her experience in the 1790s. But yeah, no, it's he talks about these delicious days that they spend in Irish Town, and one of the points he makes is that my wife and his sister, they never had to leave the table because we never engaged in any ribaldry or indecent talk, and they're kind of swapping these verses and literary impromptus, and so it is. I mean, it's a really interesting. I suppose a slightly different model of Republican sociability, which is about and a kind of enlightened model of an idealized commerce of the sexes. This is more associated with the culture of politeness, enlightened cultures of politeness, where the presence of women, and Wolfe Tone talks about this quite a lot actually, he always talks about the presence of women humanize men, they soften our manners, they make us civilized, which can be quite a conservative take, but can also be quite a progressive view of society, that actually the inclusion of women in conversation is essential to modernity. And there's others, quite a lot of people in Belfast also think in that way, that this is it's essential, that the involvement of women in sociability is a hallmark of a progressive society.
Now, mention was made of Thomas Paine's Rights of Man. Now, I recall from a lecture many years ago, I think it was David Dixon, who said that there were more copies of Paine's Rights of Man published in Ireland than the rest of the English-speaking world put together. Is that true? I mean, if I went back
per capita, yeah.
Per capita, right? Maybe it's per capita, right? And I'm assuming then, maybe ultimately you can come back in on this. I know we're moving away from Tone a little bit, but the point is, I'm assuming that it was Paine that people read, not Tone. Like Tone's audience was quite a correct. No, you're disagreeing, Marianne?
I'll take to first.
Yeah, I'm going to ride a hobby horse here, Tommy. So I'm glad you give me an idea at this point, and that is that the adjective Painite, as a simple way of describing everybody's politics in the 1790s, it's a useful shorthand, but it actually obscures sometimes the more radical reality behind it. Because let's get real about Tom Paine. When push came to shove, he didn't want to cut the king's head off. He's a liberal, right? If you want to put it in those terms. United Irishmen celebrate the king getting his head chopped off.
Yeah, there you go.
Paine ends up in jail. He's very lucky not to lose his own head. Now, obviously, I'm exaggerating for a bit of comic effect, but the point is, the adjective Painite, that everyone's ideas stopped in 1791. And if you want to understand, Irish politics,
also, there's usually Painites and king killers. They usually link them.
They do, mistakenly, but like, politics moves past Paine. It moves past 1791. It moves past 1792. You head into 93, 94. That's true in France, and it's true elsewhere. And I know Marianne wants to come in. I'll just say one quick thing about how people are reading Paine. It's also through the newspapers, because he's serialized and Burke is serialized. You don't need to read them in the pamphlets. If you read them in the newspapers, you can read them bit by bit. And if you think about Dickens and his novels and stuff, that must change the way people get the ideas. And I'm not sure we as historians have actually got the grips with that question yet.
No, I would agree with Ultan about how people, but Paine was very well known, understood, and there are figures, I can't remember where I got them from, but Paine's Rights of Man was the biggest bestseller in Ireland at the time. I think actually the whole 18th century, no, I can't be right there. But Tone's argument on behalf of the Catholics was second. And did the United Irishmen, I used to know this, but they certainly, I think they reprinted cheap versions of Payne's Rights of Man. And they gave them out free, and they did the same with Tone's argument. So we do, there are figures somewhere for that, but Payne, you're quite right, was a huge distribution in Ireland, even before Tone.
Just want to hog the time. With respect to, we mentioned Connie Anna Waddell's presenting a difficulty on religion in Belfast to Tone, but on the side of the Catholic, not on the side, but with respect to the Catholic hierarchy, their attitudes towards United Irishmen aren't exactly stellar, and they're scared blankless of what's happening in France. And certainly in Russell's case, after he's killed, they're rejoicing. I mean, there's certainly one particular cleric, Loch Isle away, taking open ads saying, rejoicing the fact that this scoundrel has left the scene, but who may actually have participated in fingering him. So turning in a United Irishman is not something they would not do, but in terms of maybe, great rank and file of Catholics, the hierarchy on the other side of that coin, maybe one side of a Presbyterian attitude within the circles of the volunteers saying, so I'm just trying to, tease that out a little bit, but in terms of the church, the hierarchy, how that affected things, or did it?
Just one thing to bear in mind, I'll come just to the things is that the Catholic Church wasn't the Catholic Church as it became in the 19th century. I mean, it was very much on the back foot. And actually, I want to throw this question now because mentions have been made about the misgivings of some of the more moderate Presbyterians in Belfast, about priestcraft and so on. But is there a sense that's what happened a century later? By the end of the 19th century, the Catholic Church had become the bogey that Presbyterians imagined to be right. Anyone comment on that? And I'll go to Sylvia after that.
Well, I don't mind commenting on it, but the hierarchy at the end of the 18th century, of course, they were very well behaved because they didn't want to upset the government, and they certainly did not trust the Presbyterians one little bit. But don't forget that they did discuss with Wolfe Tone, who was the agent and the secretary of the Catholics, and Tone himself never really lost, and I'm sure you find this, Sylvie, Tone never really lost that very Protestant attitude towards popery. And everywhere you see in Tone, the Catholics have changed, they're not what they used to be, but Tone speaks very, very highly of the Ulster Catholic hierarchy, who had been used to, they were dealing with an almost exclusively Protestant society more than they did us. And he singles out Plunkett as he's able to have an educated, enlightenment conversation. So when you say the hierarchy, and I'm going to put the kibosh on the United Irishmen, I don't think that is totally true. And actually the Catholic Committee itself and Catholic leaders were very angry with Archbishop Troy, who was so afraid of what the United Irishmen would do, but he wasn't entirely representative of the rest of the hierarchy.
No, I'm sorry to go a little bit backwards.
This guy at the back has been waiting for ages too, so sorry, Sylvie.
Oh, gentleman at the back there. Yeah.
Thank you. It's more a comment, a little bit of a question, but just the previous panelist, Claire Mitchell, has talked about this kind of absurd interest in that period in modern day Belfast, and just maybe internationally as well. The likes of Hamilton, the musical, and the upcoming movie about Napoleon, the great man view history really is coming to the fore here. And I just wonder, back in the 1980s, early 80s, was there a French production, The Year of the French? I just wonder, was that ever worth watching, or was it any use? And I just wonder, is there any sort of modern fix? Is it on YouTube? Brilliant. Okay. But I just thought it's just an interesting contrast as these kind of events happen, and level. But in the international stage, what was the great men and the revisionist kind of version of that is all people in general will be able to know about that period, I suppose.
But the Year of the French is based on the novel, so according to Ridley Scott, historians have to get a life. So it's not based on reality, but it was trilingual, the Year of the French, the TV series. They filmed in France and they filmed here, and they had Irish speakers and English speakers, so it reflects the reality of the time. Just if I may just go a little bit backwards, and by the way, Tone didn't arrive in Paris not knowing anyone. He had a coded letter to the American ambassador Monroe, who received him openly once the letter was deciphered, because we know that in Philadelphia, Rowan, Archibald Hamilton Rowan, had just arrived from France.
Well, he didn't know that.
Yeah, Wellington didn't know that, yeah, and he also knew about an obscure Irishman, a translator working an Irish exile in France who was waiting for him. So, you know, the diary, we have to be a little bit careful because Tone is weaving his insecurities, and am I getting this right? And I want to achieve something. And as Marion would know better than anyone else, quite a character emerges. So just two very brief points. He loved Belfast because here he was challenged. And the debate, I suspect, was at a level that he wouldn't have had in Dublin. And so he gets irritated because he's envious of people. And he kind of is already thinking, you know, my ideas were quite advanced. And then he's surrounded by people with a variety of opinions. So just on that final point, I think he was also a little bit envious of people like Drennan, who was a clear thinker and a clear writer. He once makes a comment about, you know, someone that no one could really attack, Thomas Addis Emmet, that he gave a remarkable pamphlet or wrote about something. But Tom Paine, I think he was a little bit envious of his success. Now we need to remember that Paine's Rights of Man is not talking about a specific Irish situation, and he speaks in a very, in a unitarian direct English, and he talks about, ridiculous hereditary monarchies, and he says, have we ever heard of a hereditary mathematician? Well, you look at one of Tone's pamphlets and he says, have we ever heard of a hereditary cobbler? So I think he's a bit envious of Paine and he kind of wants to glean ideas from him, but he's also learning from all these people. He's being stimulated by them because he was, quite a buzzing mind.
Just quickly on that question of the hierarchy, one of the things you need to bear in mind is that Castlereagh had a very, very sophisticated approach to dealing with the different religious groups. I mean, he basically gave the Catholic hierarchy Minute. Minute was the president of that hierarchy for weaning the Catholics off revolution, and he basically gave the Regium Donum to the Presbyterians, and Drennan was aware of that from day one. He saw it as basically Castlereagh's poison been put into the Presbyterians. So the government had a very sophisticated approach to the religious groups.
I just wanted to pick up on the comment about memory. I'm not touching the Napoleon film. There's been far too much stuff about that.
It'll be reviewed in the next issue of History.
I look forward to that. For my sins, I teach a module on Napoleon, which has a big thing on his memory. So I'll have to rewrite that, unfortunately, do some actual work. But the memory thing is interesting to me because I started my biography 10 years ago, which was the 250th anniversary of Tone's birth. Nothing. Nothing.
You said crickets.
Yeah, right. Everyone was worried about the decade of centenaries and the lockout. So the foundational figure of Irish republicanism, nobody cared. It was his 250th birthday. Does that mean anything? Like, historians are increasingly interested in memory. Does that mean anything? And me and Jim have talked about the next issue, which is the tendency, right? So we all know the quote, right? The unity of Protestant, Catholic, and centre. Why is there a tendency to transpose Catholic and Protestant so that Catholic comes first? Is it subconscious? Is it meaningless? Or does it reveal something about a tendency? I don't know. I genuinely can't make up my mind about this. I remember when Marianne was giving her Ford lectures in Oxford, I bumped into you, and you said to me, I'm going to say, if the United Irishmen hadn't existed, Catholic nationalism would have had to invent them. to give this sort of patina of non-sectarianism. And I wonder about the constant transposition of Catholic and Protestant. Does that have a meaning or doesn't it? I swing myself backwards and forwards on that. So I thought, if you don't mind, I'm going to ask everybody else in the room what they think about that question. Is it meaningful or meaningless?
Very briefly, and sorry to come back, and Tone played a part in that, because Tone saw the Catholics, and this is a quote from him, as the Irish properly so called. Now, Catholicism had already been associated with the nation. They were the real nation from the 17th century, in the Irish language poetry. But Tone put his print of modern Irish Republican nationalism on that old myth. And he actually says it. And he says it in his memoirs, written in not only his own writing, but the memoranda that he's sending into the French Directory. He has already said that. So, yeah.
A question that I've been kind of pondering, and now I've got all this expertise in the room. I just wanted to ask about was about Tone's mother, and as a Catholic, a convert from Catholicism. Does anybody know more about that, and have any sense of how? Because I know we were talking about Tone having, these certain Protestant prejudices, and certain people, Tom Dunn, of course, in his biography made a lot of that, and others have seen it as less significant. But, is there any sense of his awareness of that background, or?
It doesn't, Sylvie, it doesn't come out in his writings. And I know that Christopher Woods had a look at that. Can't remember what Christopher says.
I'm trying to figure out in my mind, with all the knowledge in the room, all the knowledge in the room, it's the second question, Jim, I didn't get a chance to ask you in the Crown Bar last night. When Margaret converts, first of all, Tone's about 7 or 8. And if he's in the congregation, so a new book of the Convert Laws, a second edition has come out, and the oath is there. Did he perceive a humiliation for his mother if he was indeed present? Because apparently they took the oath at the end of the service on a Sunday, and her name is enrolled on a Monday. So he's about 7 or 8, he's the oldest. The second thing, we don't know really. Apparently Madden says, because Madden would have met 2 of Tone's aunts, who would have, relayed memories of the Tone family, that she returned to her faith at the end of her life. But I just have a technical question, and it's bouncing us back into the male world. His father, Peter, married a Catholic, and then she converts at a certain stage. And in Danny Mansfield book on Grattan, people have disputed this, and they've never given me the answer, that a Protestant couldn't vote if they had a Catholic wife. Round about the time she converts.
She converted.
What?
She converted.
Yeah, but before that, would Peter have? How would Peter Tone have experienced any disabilities? He wouldn't have. Okay, well then Danny Mansfield is wrong in that book, because every undergraduate.
It's a very, very good question. But certainly in the 18th century, my understanding is that there was much more movement intermarriage, and people kind of changing their religion more often than was happening from the 19th century onwards.
Oh, of course.
And it may not have been seen that extraordinary at the time, because it is happening all over Ireland. But we just don't know. I mean, I don't think Tone ever mentions himself that his mother was a Catholic.
No.
And I can't remember who actually first pointed it out. Was it Frank McDermott? I can't remember.
And I'm assuming his claim in his autobiography that he never met a Catholic until his adult life. That's.
I think he knows the Catholic committee, though. He says that the Catholics, with whom one of them I was then acquainted, and I think he's talking about the political grouping. I presume, because it would seem weird to say that you hadn't met a Catholic in his life.
If they were going to, Tone's entire education was within the the Protestant elite, you know, and I would imagine that the mother was very, very anxious because she seemed to be a very good mother and proud of her children and pushing them. That she wouldn't have been pushing any kind of Catholicism forward. So why would Tone be that aware? That's what I'm saying. Why would he be that aware that his mother had been? And I can't even remember who first pointed it out and what the proof is. There must be proof, but who first pointed it out? Because I couldn't really find anything about it. Anyway.
I think that is an interesting question. Just raise it again for you. Who said that he wished to unite Protestant, Catholic, and Dissenter? Again and again, you come over this phrase, Catholic, Protestant, and Dissenter. Get the sequence mixed up. Myself included, right? But I'm not sure if that's significant. I think it's partly the way memory works. You know, James Cagney. James Cagney did not say, "You dirty rat." Humphrey Bogart did not say, "Play the game, son." Jack Lynch did not say, "We will not stand idly by." And Margaret Thatcher never said that Northern Ireland was as British as Finchley. Not one of those. That is all the version. That's the versions that we all carry about in our head. You know, even though all of them were demonstrably never said. And I think that's probably the case with Catholic Protestant. And I still can say that. Accidentally.
I had a quick question for Katrina, if I could. Is it the case Matilda marries Wilson in 1816? Yet Wolfe in 1798, in one of his last letters from prison, in a postscript says, "Wilson is a good man, he will not desert you." Why does it take 18 years for them to get married?
How old was she, by the way, just when you get there?
By then, so she must have been in her late 40s by the time when she remarried.
Is it a marriage of necessity, though? I mean, in terms of an income.
Well, no, she has the pension. Actually, I don't know what happens to it. I mean, she does have the pension from the French state, and I don't know actually. And there has been a very good. I feel particularly abashed because a colleague or my mentor Jane Rendell and Christopher Woods have done a whole research piece, an article about Thomas Wilson and who he was, and which I have not recently read. I can't really remember, so I'm trying to. I don't know how much.
Slogging through the 3-volume set, I came across his time apart from Matilda, and every mention of her on the page was either preceded or followed by a mention of Russell. Every page. Yeah, there is not an exception that I found. So when Matilda pops in his mind, Russell pops in his mind, or vice versa. And so they're commingling these memories of fun and Irish town and Rams Island and all that is being this really joyous memory that he's got. But it maybe speaks to your editor's comment.
No, absolutely. From what Marianne was saying, my students, I do a week where we read the memoir. We do a week on Wolfe Tone, and they always ask if there is a homoerotic subtext in the relationship between Russell and Tone. The other thing that they've increasingly started to ask is, this is very Gen Z, did Tone have attention deficit disorder? About their desire to retrospectively diagnose.
Jason, just
not to take away from Tone himself, but I've been thinking since Claire was speaking about memory and remembering and misremembering, is that how you term it? Having done work around the United Irishmen, around shared history projects, cross-community relations, I'm just thinking, what is the future for Bodenstown? Because I was down there last year and it was the first time, and happy to say, from a mixed background, whether that's in national or Republican national circles and Protestant loyalist circles. And when you go down to Bodenstown, the triumphalism of it is very reminiscent for me. I don't know when it was done, but of that sort of Republican agenda in the 1970s. It's quite harsh, and it's sort of, to me, when I was there, spoke more to the Civil War than it did to the United Irishmen and what the United Irishmen represented. So what is, or should we be looking at how we commemorate differently if we're looking towards the shared island and the New Ireland, and what does that entail? Maybe a wee bit too in depth, or
Which Bodenstown did you go to though?
yeah.
It depends which, which organisation was sponsoring the.
No, sorry. I mean, I didn't go down to a commemoration. I was just down in Dublin, had some time, and I went out to the churchyard.
Right.
Myself, just to have a look around, experience it, and go and visit Tone, because I previously worked here at Clifton House for 6 years, so it was about just I've done Clifton Street Cemetery, and I wanted to go down and pay my respects.
No, but are you talking about the triumphalism of the pilgrimage to Bodenstown, or
the built environment? So obviously concreted over graves, the quotes that are on the ground are put onto it. It was just an interesting experience from somebody from Northern Ireland, from a mixed background, who's very much studied United Irishmen within an Ulster context, to be down there to see that landscape almost. When you walk into this small medieval church and then walk around the back, it's quite intense atmosphere.
It was completely redone in the early 70s, I think, so wasn't it? And a lot of bad stuff went up in the 70s, including what they did in Bodenstown. So I sympathise.
Wearing his cap as the editor of History Ireland, Tommy will tell you that I contributed a piece. He has a platform feature where contributors get on a platform. And I wrote a piece called Time to Decommission Bodenstown, ? Christopher Woods has edited the last volume and worked on the first 2 volumes, and has done other wonderful work, including decrypting Thomas Russell's handwriting. Wrote a book about the pilgrimages to Bodenstown, and in the later chapters, he writes about the 1970s. So that helped me just get a few elements together. Essentially, you were entirely correct. We had this discussion downstairs. In the 1970s, after a UBF bomb, something was replaced, and as Christopher Wood said in his book, and I said in the article, would it get planning permission today? No, it would not. And there's a gentle conversation going on in Kildare County Council, but I think it needs to be at national level. In the 1970s, the National Graves Association created an arena where speechifying or commemoration, whatever you might call it, would happen. But they embedded quotes about anti-treaty quotes, totally anachronistic. They have the lovely sort of medallion portrait of Tone on the wall, which is quite nice. It's 1970s concrete, it's Stalinist, it's grey, but they also poured concrete over graves, over the neighbors of the Tones, possibly, siblings of Tone, an uncle, we don't know. But they were prods, so that was okay. And there is a debate out in Kildare because they have to extend the cemetery because it's an actual living cemetery. But I think you're right. I think it's something that is quite questionable. And there needs to be some lobbying. It's frozen in a 1970s anti-treaty Republican 32 county with themes and slogans just in the cement that, as Christopher said, have, like most of the speeches, nothing to do with Tone.
Now, I just want to raise one more question here, and maybe I'll go to you, Marianne, and this, and that's Tone's discretion, right? Because Tone leaves Ireland in, what is it? What month? May 95, right? And the next thing the British know about him, he's in Bantry Bay, right? And given the point is, like, here's a man he's in Paris, he's on his own, like, you could forgive him, like, if he has a few drinks and that's yapping with some people, because, and of course we're all very grateful, all of us, both in this period, for all the spies and informers for creating this fantastic archive. So like, he seems exceptional in that regard.
Way back when I did a bit of comparison between him and the other foreign patriots negotiating for help. And he was pretty exceptional, actually. And but don't forget, he was kind of on his own. And whilst he did have the introduction of Sylvie says through Monroe, there weren't really other Irish people there that kind of, when they started coming in towards the end of 1797, that's when his cover was blown. But the word discreet, I mean, discreet I would never have actually used with Tone, but I think you're right, actually. He was circumspect, but Tone could be quite impetuous. He would see a goal and he'd go for it. And things that were extraneous, he didn't bother with. And I think that's what happened to him in Paris. He was on a sense of mission, and it was one of the reasons why he was so lonely. You know, page after page talks about his loneliness, because he had actually, that's what he'd chosen to behave like. Discretion, I'm not, yeah, okay, it's not a word I would have used with Tone, but there's certainly something going on there, that he's got a mission, he's got a goal, and he just heads for it. And yes, the British don't hear until...
Just make one point for Cameron. No, I was talking to Tom Bartlett, Tom's departed, but Tom a few years ago discovered a document, I don't know who wrote it, right?
Yeah.
Which actually outlines Tone's mission. But and this is like in 95, 96, like it outlines the whole plan, right? And as Tom Bartlett put it then, but it kind of fell behind the sofa. You know, it never got to the, you know, so just because you gather information doesn't necessarily mean the people at the top get to see it, you know. So the difference between information and intelligence, you know. Ken, you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I'm going back to old Tom's point about newspapers. You know, Tone's in France, it's weeks, possibly a couple of months, before he discovers, for example, that Russell and Nielsen have been arrested, and that was in September 1796. So I think that there's a lag in terms of public discourse and communication. And I think one of the points that Tom Bartlett has made in his great series of the annotation of Francis Higgins' letters to Cook in Dublin Castle is that we have this notion that the intelligence is omniscient, that they know everything in Dublin Castle about what's going on. Actually, that's not the case. Cook and others are petrified in April and May 1798 because they feel they know very little about what the United Irishmen's plans actually are. That document is a cracking document that Tommy's referred to. It's in the Camden papers in Kent. And it was written by the collector of Belfast, who was Skeffington. And I think it was written to Cook, and it basically says, yeah, Tone has recently departed Belfast. He's going to America, he's actually planning to go to France. I mean, everything is revealed there.
Yeah.
And yet it does seem to fall down the back of the sofa. And in fact, I think the first information that the government sources actually knew about Tone being on board in the Bantry expedition was late 1797. And that information came directly.
Oh, so it's a year later. I got that wrong. It's actually
that information was forwarded down by Samuel Turner, who's an informer in Europe. You know, arguably one of the most important United Irishmen in 1797 and 1798, but not for the reasons we usually associate.
Sorry, just quickly. Just on Tone in Paris, I wonder sometimes. Sylvie described as the hero of his own novel in the journals, I think. And he's definitely lonely, but you get the odd snippet of, oh, I had dinner with she and his nephew, but there's a little bit more sociability going on, I think, with the French military than the journals would have you believe.
A bit later, not at first.
Not at first, no, I agree. Yeah, not first.
And could I just add one thing? One of the reasons that the government back home wasn't worried about Tone. I mean, the reason that he was allowed to slip away is that there was this feeling that, you know, he wasn't dangerous. He was a gifted journalist, and they were actually quite glad to get rid of him because he would write this stuff, but they weren't monitoring him. You know, he wasn't seen as a danger, and I think that was part of how he was able to get away with it. That he wasn't being watched. So.
Not sure about that, Marianne. I mean, the point is, isn't Tone a marked man from early on? Like, I mean, people like see Tone as a.
Fitzgibbon is very unusual.
Okay, so I assume that Fitzgibbon represents the regime.
And the reason Fitzgibbon has it in for Tone since he eloped with, because Matilda Tone was a relative of Fitzgibbon. And Tone was judged to have acted dishonorably.
Okay.
And Fitzgibbon was watching him before he'd ever kind of reached any note. And it was Fitzgibbon that made a big thing of the letter in 1791, you know, making out that, you know, he was this dangerous person. But Fitzgibbon was alone.
Okay.
But of course, after the outbreak of war with France, in which anything that Tone had written back in 1791 wasn't considered treason, but it was by 1793, and Fitzgibbon was blowing his cover, but Fitzgibbon was taking it as a family offence because he was a relative of the Witheringtons, that Tone had run away with their daughter. But he was very unusual. You're right to pick him out, but he was very unusual.
I was going to add to that, Marianne, doesn't General Clark, who makes a big thing about his Franco-Irish, his kind of understanding of Ireland, which is, Wolfe Tone says, is hopelessly out of date. But didn't he say at one point to Tone, oh, do you think Fitzgibbon will come over to the side of revolution, that, you know, once the French have landed?
Yes, and Tone goes, what?
Now, I'm just looking at the time here, guys. Is there anybody else who wants to come in? Yeah, just.
More I would have hosted with the microphone, just on the remembering Tone and Bodenstein. I know it's for certain people from South Derry, they went down in the 70s, my father and his brothers included, in pipe bands and that. It does hold a certain place in people's hearts, and remembering or refashioning it in a modern, like to one, just remember the loyalist fallen, and two, just remember that particular version of republicanism. I think is a wrong place to go down, just in terms of poems, commemoration, or monuments and names, to remember them all across the south. I can think of Wolfe Tone Quay, Bantry Bay, Wolfe Tone streets in nearly every town and village around Ireland. But in the town of Dublin, it's O'Connell Street. Was O'Connell not a yeoman? Was O'Connell not? And O'Connell remains there. But the monster of a statue in the main street named after him. And Wolfe Tone, I believe, in Dublin is relegated corner of a park. So
there's a street.
Yeah.
Is it key?
And a monument.
But just in terms of just the Bodenstown, it's like you thought about the pain being the Quran in Belfast, but it's almost like the Hajj in Ireland and to certain Republicans, and I don't think remodeling it and just remembering is the way to go.
Yeah, but I think just
soon to be a library.
I think what's talked about here is just the grave and the immediate area. I mean, I don't see the tradition of the kind of pilgrimage to Bodenstown ever die out. And I've been on it myself several times, and it has a certain, Fergus, you must have been on it, you know, has a certain atmosphere and so on, right? Which is not problematic at all, actually, in my opinion. It's the actual physical thing which is just ugly, and you know, I mean, for a whole load of reasons, right? But we're not talking about some sort of a what's the word I'm looking for? A denaming or the equivalent of a denaming, right? Whatever, you know, not at all. Does anybody else want to come in? Because I think the clock is beating us here.
I want to say that I went to Bodestown and
You the last word here, Bill. You're organizing the whole thing.
That's here for the man.
Yeah.
Let's see. June 17th, right past, was the closest date to his death date. I appeared there 2 hours early, And I had read Chris Wood's book. And I went pissed off, thinking I'm going to see a misappropriation of his message, his words. Well, what happened was I was there and I ran into Wolfe Tone's gravekeeper. He lives about 12 kilometers away and he comes by every day to make sure everything's in order. I interviewed him. And he is an amazing guy who's dedicated his life to making sure this is going to stay the way it is. The drums in the background start to appear in my ears, and I'm realizing that Sinn Féin is making their way up from Salins, and they come through the arch in the cemetery. The kids are first. The flags, the drums are next. The flags are behind them. It's a joyous celebration, and it was recognized by a song that went on for probably 12 and a half minutes with an 80-year-old man. You never thought it was going to end, but it just kept going. And everybody just was so mesmerized by it. The place had 300 or 400 people, and I have to apologize to the whoever I was reacting against when I finished Chris Wood's book and saying, this can't be that all these people are here saying Wolfe Tone's mine. No, you can't have it. But it was they had a speaker from Limerick. She gave an Irish speech and she spoke in English as well. And it was very, very touching. So if you all are okay with that, I just turn it on. I have one other thing. Okay. You want to change that for me? I like that. Now I'm going to give you 2 minutes. That's all you get. Now, come on up here.
Yeah, it's great. It's fantastic. Having this great panel today. Thank you for that.
Okay.
Glad I have that 2 cents. That's right. So we actually can do what historians aren't supposed to do, make history, but there is a chance to vote for Tone and to add to it by the voting for the Trinity College Library. So I'll just leave this out here. Here's the link.
No.
Right here. Oh, I'll do it here. Okay. So
Yeah, I was thinking that.
So, I mean, it's not some old project.
I think it would be an insult.
The worst thing is like it's going down.
Name it off.
It's a new name for the library.
An insult to the man.
It's encouraging people.
Yeah.
So
Go up to the picture.
Spends a little time.
The library. It still looks that bad and gray, but
Formerly known.
Formerly known. So that's history, folks. Berkeley's out. But we made a decision within their structure.
For what reason?
Well, the slave
owning,
side.
yeah.
Oh, slavery. Yeah, that's
So, slave owner,
But it's all conservative.
he's had his days. I'm not going to defend or offend or say, but the fact is, like it or not, Berkeley's gone and they need a new name. And we've got the perfect recommendation. So you can today, tomorrow, anytime soon, and they ask you a golden question. What about your nominee, whether it's Tone or anybody else? What have they done for inclusion? And we haven't got the bill of goods and inclusion with Wolfe Tone, what we've been looking
We'll
at
just
today.
attach, the argument, and that'll be it.
Yeah, I mean,
Is-
accurate clause to the center is not exactly accurate. There's
Is
plenty
there
of
a-
other forms of words in
is
this
there
life that we could use to make that happen.
Yes, so the consulting.
There is the link.
Yeah.
I'll leave the papers here, but you can look it up.
It's a nonpartisan thing, guys.
You're a tribute.
I think already.
Don't have to be, you put your vote for it, so you're, I'm not gonna say you're armed to do it, but you're empowered to do it. How about that? Thanks a lot.
In certain organization. Here. Is that just like to